Have you ever stood at the edge of a hollow and felt, not fear exactly, but the particular stillness of a place that remembers things better than the people who left it do? Not a haunting, not a sound, just the sense that the ground beneath your boots has been holding something in for a very long time, the way a person holds a breath before they speak a name they are not sure they should say out loud. Have you ever walked a creek bank in early November, when the leaves are down and the light comes through the bare trees in long pale needles, and understood that you are not the first person to walk that exact ground, not by 100 years, and that the last person who stood where you are standing did not leave of their own choosing? There is a cut in the ridge country of Caldwell County, Virginia, that the local people called Widow's Cut. It is a narrow place, no more than 30 yards across at the widest, where the east wall of Sorrow Ridge drops straight down into a dry creek bed, and the west wall rises again just as straight, so that standing in the bottom you can look up and see a strip of sky no wider than a man's hand. The kind of place that has a name because something happened in it. Not a romantic name, not a settler's name. A name that was given to it the way you give a name to a scar. In the winter of 1872, a girl was found at Widow's Cut. She was 11 years old. Her name was Cora Vess. She had been missing for 9 days, and when the men who found her lifted her out of the dry creek bed and carried her down to the road, she had not a scratch on her, not a bruise, not a chigger bite, and her boots were clean. What she had, instead of any of those things, was a single rule. One thing she would not do. No matter who asked her or how gently, she would not say her sister's name twice. Not in a row, not in the same hour, not in the same day, if she could help it. And when someone pushed her on it, when her mother, desperate and grieving and not yet understanding the reason, pressed her daughter's hands between her own and said, "Cora, why, just say it, just say Ellen once more. Just for me," Cora Vess would go still, not frightened, not angry, still in the way a door goes still after it has been barred. And she would look at her mother with an expression that the people who knew her described in 3 separate accounts across 40 years with the same word, patient, as though she was waiting for the person asking to understand something that she, at 11 years old, already understood completely. She kept that rule for the next 61 years, until the morning she died in 1933, and in all that time she never explained it, not to her mother, not to her husband, not to her children, not to the county man who came asking in 1915, not to the preacher who sat with her in the last weeks. She had written it down, though. She had written it all down, starting on the 14th of January, 1873, 7 weeks after she came out of the cut, in a composition book she asked for from the school teacher in Alderman's Mill, and she had written it in a hand that her daughter described in 1958 as too steady for a child, as though she was copying something rather than remembering it. That composition book is what tonight is built on, and I am going to read you the whole of it, but not yet. Not for a while, because if I put it in front of you now, you will read it the way the county man read it in 1915, as the writing of a child who had a bad fright in a ravine, and you will be wrong in the same way he was wrong, and you will spend the next 3 hours comfortable when you should not be. I would rather you understand the place first, and the family, and the 9 days, and what was found in the cut besides Cora herself. And by the time I read you the composition book, I think you will already know what most of it means, because you will have been walking toward it all night. Before I go on, if this is the kind of case you would want 10 of, and not one, slow, true, told from the ground up, in the voice of the people who lived it, I have been putting these together into a collection called What the Hollow Keeps. 12 cases, 6 states, 1844 to 1947, 11 hours, end to end. Every one of them a family that learned something in a particular piece of ground that they were never able to entirely unlearn. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And right now, before I take you any further into this, tell me where you are listening from tonight. Put it in the comments. The town, the county, the country. I want to see how far this one reaches into the dark. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the next one finds you on the next long night you cannot sleep. Now then, Caldwell County, Virginia. Not a famous county. Not a county anyone has written a book about, or made a film in, or named a landmark after. It sits in the western part of the state, in the ridge and valley country where the mountains do not soar the way they do in the popular imagination, but instead fold, one on top of another, in long parallel ridges running northeast to southwest, like a cloth someone has pushed from both ends. Sorrow Ridge is one of them. It is 11 miles long and just over 3,000 feet at its highest point, and it has a western face that is all second-growth hardwood and an eastern face that is limestone shelf breaking into scree, and somewhere on the east face, roughly 4 miles from the southern end, is the cut in the rock that gave a hollow its name. To get there in 1872, you came up the Alderman's Mill Road, which followed Sorrow Creek from the flat country, and you turned at the mill onto a wagon track that climbed 2 miles to the head of the hollow, and at the head of the hollow the track stopped and the ridge rose. The cut in the ridge was known. Local people used it to cross from the Sorrow Creek side to the Falling Branch side, the way the deer used it, because a narrow cut is faster than going over the top. It was a working part of the local geography. Children walked through it, and then, in the fall of 1872, it stopped being a place children walked. Let me tell you what I am working from, because you are owed that before anything else. There are 5 bodies of material. The first is the county record. Caldwell County Court Minutes, 1850 through 1900, held in the county clerk's office in the courthouse in Harrowfield. The relevant entries run from December of 1872 through March of 1873 and include a coroner's inquiry, 2 depositions, and a single county commissioner's report that was filed and never acted on, the way these things often were. The second is a church record. The minutes and membership roll of Sorrow Creek Baptist Church, 1860 through 1910, kept by a succession of deacons and held now in a university archive 2 counties over. There are 3 entries in late 1872 that bear directly on this case, and they are short and written in the flat, declarative prose of a man who has decided to record a fact and not its meaning. The third is newspaper. The Harrowfield Courier ran 2 items, one in December of 1872, when the girl was found, and one in February of 1873, when the coroner's inquiry concluded. Both are short. Both leave out more than they include. But they give us names and dates and the one physical detail from the cut that the county preferred not to put in official documents. The fourth is oral. In 1906, a collector of local history named Edmund Garrett Mosley spent 4 months in Caldwell County gathering material for a county history that was never published. His notebooks survived him and are in private hands, and I have read transcriptions of 17 pages that are directly relevant to this case. Mosley interviewed 9 people who had direct knowledge of the events of 1872, including 2 men who were on the recovery party that brought Cora out of the cut, and 1 woman who was Cora Vess's nearest neighbor for 30 years. And the 5th is the composition book itself. 11 pages, front and back, in the hand of an 11-year-old girl who was not, by any account, a remarkable student. It surfaced in 1958 when Cora's youngest daughter, a woman named Hattie Vess Dunmore, gave it to the local historical society along with a shoebox of family papers. It had been kept in a cedar chest in a back room for 25 years, and before that in a locked drawer in Cora's own house for 41 years before that. Hattie said she did not know her mother kept a written record. She said she found it wrapped in oilcloth inside a flour sack at the bottom of the cedar chest, under 2 quilts and a pair of gloves. She said her mother never mentioned it. Not once. That is 5 bodies of material. Everything I say to you tonight comes out of one of them. When I am guessing, I will say so. When the sources disagree, and they do disagree twice, in ways that are more disturbing than either version alone, I will lay both out and let you sit with it. All right. The Vess family. Harlan Vess was 39 years old in the fall of 1872. He ran a small farm at the head of the Sorrow Creek Hollow, 40 acres, most of it too steep for row crops but good for cattle and for the apple orchard his father had put in 30 years before. He was a quiet man, described in the Moseley notebooks by 2 different sources as steady, which in that time and place was the highest compliment available, and the one most people hoped for on their gravestones. He could read and cipher, which put him ahead of about 1/3 of the men in that hollow, and he kept his accounts in a ledger he bought every 2 years from the mill store in Alderman's. His wife was Prudence Vess, born Prudence Keaton, age 36. She was from the next county over and had come to Sorrow Creek at 17 as the wife of a man she had met exactly twice before the ceremony. She had the unsentimental competence of a woman who understood very young that her life was going to require her to be capable of most things, and she had organized herself accordingly. She could butcher a hog, set a bone, deliver a calf, and read a legal document, and she had done all 4 in the same month, once without remarking on it to anyone. She had also buried 2 children before the events of this story, a boy at 2 weeks in 1864, and a girl at 4 years old in 1867. Her way of carrying those losses was to not carry them, visibly, in a way that the women around her both respected and found frightening, because a grief that does not show itself is a grief that has gone somewhere, and where it goes is a question that other people lie awake asking. There were 3 living children in the fall of 1872. Ellen Vess was 13, Cora Vess was 11, and a boy named Harlan Jr., called June by everyone, was 7. Ellen and Cora. I am going to give you the specific things about them now, the small and particular things, because this is the kind of story where the small things are the whole story, and because the composition book turns on 3 details about Ellen that Cora recorded on the first page, and I want you to have them before anything else happens. Ellen Vess was 13 years old, and she was the kind of child who caused adults to feel, without quite knowing why, that she was watching them more carefully than they were watching her. Not unsettling, not strange, just precise. She had a way of sitting at the edge of a room and taking it all in that made people, years later when they tried to describe her, reach for the word old and then apologize for the word as though it were an insult when it was not. She was simply already herself, at 13, in a way that most people do not manage until they are 30. She had a habit, when she was working on something difficult, arithmetic, a tight seam, a word she was trying to spell, of humming one single note, low and held, not quite under her breath, not a tune, not a song, just a held note the way you hold a candle into a room before you step in to see where the shadows are. Her mother could not stand it. Her father never seemed to hear it. Cora, in the composition book, calls it Ellen's thinking sound, and writes about it with the casualness of someone describing a weather pattern, something that has been part of the landscape so long it no longer requires comment. Ellen could find things. This is the second detail, and I want to say it plainly. She could find things that were lost, not magically, not with a gift. She simply reasoned about where things would be better than anyone else in the family did, and she was right a remarkable percentage of the time, and the other members of the family had developed the habit, over years, of simply bringing her their questions about missing objects and waiting for the answer. Cora writes, Ellen always knew where the thing you lost had gone to think about things. She writes it as a joke, as something a child would say, and then she writes, I still believe that is exactly right. The third detail about Ellen, and the one that matters most, and the one I need you to hold on to for the entire duration of tonight, Ellen was left-handed. She had always been left-handed, and unlike in some households this had never been corrected, because Harlan Vess was also left-handed, and he had decided privately that the school teacher's habit of beating it out of children was a waste of a good hand. So Ellen wrote with her left, and Harlan wrote with his left, and the household arranged itself accordingly without ceremony. Cora was right-handed. June was right-handed. Left-handedness was simply a thing Ellen and her father shared, like the color of their eyes. Left-handed. The thinking sound. The finding of lost things. Those three things are on the first page of the composition book, written before any account of what happened, as though Cora understood that whoever read what she had written would need to know her sister before they could understand what the cut had tried to give back. The summer of 1872 was dry. This is confirmed by three separate sources. The Harrowfield Courier ran a piece in August about the state of the corn, the church minutes mention a prayer for rain at the August meeting, and Mosley records it from two of his interviews. A dry summer in the Ridge Country does specific things to the landscape. The creeks drop. The springs go intermittent. The rock faces, that are usually green with seep water, go gray and dry and pale, and the cracks in them widen, and things that have been held inside those cracks for a long time, seeds, bones, objects, other things, come out. This is worth saying because one of the men who went into Widow's Cut on the recovery party in December of 1872 told Mosley in 1906 that the cut looked different from how it had looked the previous spring. He said the walls had opened up. He said there were cracks in the limestone that he had never seen before, or, if they had been there before, they had been hairline and were now finger-wide, running vertically up the rock face in both walls, from the creek bed to as high as a man could see. He said it looked like something had been pressing against the inside of the walls. He said he did not go back after the recovery. He said the other man on the party, a neighbor named Willis Creed, never went back either, and that the two of them had an agreement, informal and unspoken, to not discuss what they had seen in there. He said they kept that agreement for 34 years, until Mosley came around with his notebooks. He said when he finally talked about it, he felt not better, but lighter. The way you feel when you put down a weight you forgot you were carrying. September in that hollow was the apple season, and the apple season was the main event of the year. The orchard Harlan Vess's father had planted was known up and down the creek for two varieties in particular, a late-keeping russet and a sweet yellow that did not have a printed name, but that everyone in the hollow called Vess Yellows, and both were in demand from the mill store in Alderman's. The whole family worked the harvest from late August into October, and it is worth knowing this because it is the context for the events of the 2nd of November, 1872, which is the day the 9 days started. On the morning of Saturday, the 2nd of November, 1872, Ellen Vess walked up to the cut to look for a knife. I want to explain that sentence because it is the kind of sentence that sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale and is not. It is, as far as I can tell, completely ordinary. A paring knife had gone missing from the kitchen 3 days before, and Prudence had mentioned it twice, and Ellen, who was Ellen, had decided to think about where a paring knife would go if it left a kitchen. She had apparently arrived at the conclusion, through some process that Cora says she could not explain, that it had been carried up to the cut by her brother June, who was 7, and who had a habit of pocketing small, shiny things and forgetting about them, and who had been up to the cut with some older boys from the creek the week before. So Ellen put on her coat and told Cora she was going up to look, and Cora asked to come, and Ellen said no, she would be back for dinner, and she went out the door at about 9 in the morning. She did not come back for dinner. She did not come back that evening. She did not come back the next morning. By the afternoon of the 3rd of November, Harlan Vess had assembled 11 men from the hollow, and they went up to the cut. They found nothing. No knife. No sign of Ellen. The creek bed was dry. It ran only in the wet months, and the limestone gravel in it did not hold prints, and there was nowhere obvious that a person could go from the bottom of the cut because the walls were straight up on both sides, and the only exits were the two ends of the passage, 30 yards apart. A person could come in one end and go out the other, and that was the whole of it. There was no side passage. There was no cave. There was nowhere to go but through. The search ran from the 3rd of November through the 10th, and it covered the ridge in both directions and both sides, and the falling branch drainage on the east face, and 3 miles of the creek below the hollow. Caldwell County did not have a sheriff at that time. The position had been vacant since August, and the search was organized by Harlan Vess himself and a neighbor named Alton Shade, who was the local justice of the peace. At its peak on the 5th and 6th of November, there were something over 40 men on that ridge, prey. They found no trace of Ellen Vess. And then, on the morning of the 12th of November, 9 days after Ellen went up to the cut and did not come back, Harlan Vess went out to the barn at 5 in the morning to do the milking, and sitting on the top rail of the fence between the barn and the house, in the dark and the cold, was Cora. Not Ellen, Cora, the younger sister. Harlan said to Mosley, through Mosley's transcript, that his first thought, seeing a child on the fence rail in the November dark, was that it was Ellen, and that this thought lasted only a second before he understood it was not, and that those two thoughts, first the hope and then the correction, were the worst 2 seconds of the whole 9 days, and that he wished he could give back those 2 seconds, and that he never could. He called her name. She turned and looked at him. He asked her what in God's name she was doing out in the cold at 5 in the morning, and she said, in a voice he described as ordinary as bread, that she had come home and that she was hungry. He picked her up and carried her in, and Prudence was called and candles were lit, and Cora sat at the kitchen table and ate 3 biscuits and some cold beans, while her parents stood on either side of her and asked, quietly and then less quietly, where she had been and where was Ellen. She said she had been in the cut. She said Ellen was not with her. She said she did not know where Ellen was. And then she said the thing that the family did not understand for 6 months, and that Cora herself did not explain in the composition book for 41 pages of tight, patient, 11-year-old handwriting. She said, "Do not say Ellen's name twice." Prudence said, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Cora said it again. She said it 3 times, in fact, in the same even voice, before her parents stopped pressing her, which they did not do because that, in a child who had been missing for 9 days, was so wrong that it stopped them the way a strange smell in a barn stops you before you know what you are smelling. They put her to bed. It was not yet 6 in the morning. Harlan sat up by the fire. Prudence sat in the doorway of the children's room and watched Cora sleep. And Cora slept, and she did not dream, or if she dreamed, she did not move, and by the time the light came, Prudence had already made a decision about the composition book, though she did not know yet that she had made it. The physical examination, and I use that term loosely, because a physical examination in Caldwell County in November of 1872 meant Prudence Vess looking her daughter over in the morning light turned up nothing. No injuries, no frostbite, which was remarkable because the nights had been in the 20s. No lice, no ticks, no bramble scratches on the hands and face. Her dress was clean, her hair was combed. Her boots, when Prudence took them off and turned them over, had no mud on the soles and no stones in the stitching. Prudence Vess, in a deposition given to the county coroner in January of 1873, said, "My daughter looked as though she had been somewhere indoors." That is the deposition. Somewhere indoors. Those two words in the deposition of a woman who chose every word with the care of someone spending the last of something, and she chose those two words, and she had to know what they implied, and she wrote them down anyway. Now, I want to stop here and be honest with you about something, because this is the point in a story like this where it is easy to run ahead, and I am not going to do that. I have told you that Cora came home on the 12th of November, 9 days after her sister did not come back. I have told you that she was clean and uninjured, and that she had a single rule about a name. I have not yet told you why she was in the cut in the first place, because the answer to that is in the composition book, and the composition book is 11 pages, and I am not going to skip to the end of it. What I am going to do is take you through those 9 days, not as Cora experienced them, but as the community around the Vess family experienced them, because there is a second story running alongside Cora's that most accounts of this case have ignored, and it is the story of what was seen and heard in the Sorrow Creek Hollow in those 9 days while a child was missing in a ridge cut. And that story has exactly one witness whose account I trust completely, and her name was Nettie Furl. But Nettie Furl was 58 years old in November of 1872. She had lived in the Hollow her entire life, born there, married there, widowed there in 1857, and still there when Mosley came around in 1906. She lived in the last house before the Vess place, about a quarter-mile down the creek, and she had been a neighbor of the Vess family for as long as there had been a Vess family in the Hollow, and she knew Prudence and Ellen and Cora and June, the way you know the furniture in your own front room, not with any ceremony, just as permanent and understood parts of the landscape. She was also the Hollow's keeper of what Mosley calls, in his notes, the old knowledge, which is a collector's way of saying that Nettie Furl knew things about the ridge that had not been written down anywhere, and that she did not volunteer without being asked. Mosley got her account in one sitting on an October afternoon in 1906, and he wrote 9 pages. I am going to work through all 9, because every page of it matters. She said that on the 3rd of November, the morning after Ellen did not come home, and before the search had properly organized, she went up to the cut herself, alone, early, before anyone was up. She said she went because she wanted to see the state of it before 40 men walked through it. She said the cut looked the same as it always looked, except for one thing. She said the walls were breathing. Now, I am not going to skip past that sentence. I am not going to soften it or rationalize it or explain it away with a geological process. I am going to give you Mosley's transcript, as close as I can reconstruct it from the description I was given. She said the walls of the cut, the limestone walls, were moving, not the way water moves, not the way leaves move, not the way anything moves that has an obvious explanation. Moving the way a chest moves when the person inside it is breathing. In and out, very slightly, very slowly, too slow to catch if you were not watching for it. The whole length of both walls, in unison, in and out. She watched it for what she described as about 5 minutes. Then she left. She did not run. She said she walked back down the track to the creek road at the same pace she had come up, and she did not look back, and when she got home, she sat down in her kitchen and thought about what she had seen, and she thought about it for the rest of that day, without coming to any conclusion that she was willing to name out loud. That night, she said, something came to her fence. She was specific about the time, after midnight and before 2 in the morning, because she had wound the clock before bed, and the clock said 1:45 when she finally got up to look. She heard the fence gate, which was a wooden drop-bar gate on the roadside of her yard, and she heard it the way you hear something when it is opened very slowly and carefully by someone who does not want to be heard, which is that you hear it anyway, and the slowness and the care are worse than a bang would be. She went to the window. There was enough moon to see the yard. She looked at the fence. She looked at the gate. The gate was closed. The bar was in place. And standing just outside it, on the roadside, was a shape. She said shape because she would not say person. She was clear about that with Mosley. She said, I will not call it a person because I am not sure that is what it was, and I have spent 34 years making sure I am precise about this, so I will say shape. The shape was about the right size for a 13-year-old girl. It was standing still. It was facing the house. In the moonlight, she could not see its face clearly because the face was angled slightly downward, as though it was looking at the gate bar rather than at the house, in the particular way a person looks at a latch they are trying to figure out. Nettie Furl said she watched it for about 3 minutes, and in that 3 minutes it did not move, and she did not move, and then a cloud came across the moon, and when the cloud passed, the road was empty. She said, I went back to bed, and I lay there, and I did something I had not done since I was a girl. I said my own name out loud, in the dark, 3 times, my full name, and then I said the names of my children and my husband, though my husband had been dead 15 years. I said all their names, in the dark, out loud, and I waited until the room felt like my room again, and then I slept. Mosley asked her why she said the names. She said, because a name said out loud in a room you know, in a voice you know is yours, is the surest rope back to yourself that I know of. You say the names. You stay yourself. You do not give it anything to work with. She paused, and then she said, the girl who came out of the cut alive understood that. The other one never had the chance. I want to slow down here and tell you what Nettie Furl knew about Widow's Cut, because what she knew was old and specific, and she had never told it to anyone she did not trust completely, and she told Mosley only because she was 58 years old in 1906, and doing arithmetic in her head about how much longer someone who knew these things was going to be available to say them. She said the cut had a name before it was called Widow's Cut. She said the older name was in a language she did not know and could not spell, but that the sound of it, as her grandmother had given it to her, was something like where the ridge calls back. She said every ridge and mountain had places like it, places where the rock itself was thin, not geologically thin, not thin in any way you could measure with a device, but thin in the way that old people in the hill country had always meant when they said a piece of ground was thin. Thin between what is here and what is on the other side of here. Thin between what you can see and what is seeing you back. She said the people who had been in that country before her grandmother's grandmother were very clear about what to do with thin places. You marked them. You named them. You did not build near them. You did not send animals through them alone. You did not stand in them at night, and you did not speak names in them under any circumstances, because in a thin place a name spoken out loud does not stop at the walls. She said her grandmother had told her, and her grandmother's mother had told her grandmother, that a name spoken in a thin place goes through and is heard by whatever is on the other side, and that whatever is on the other side is not good or evil in the way that a person is good or evil, but is simply hungry, the way the dark is hungry, meaning not in a violent way, but in the patient way of something that has been waiting a very long time and has learned to wait very well. And she said that what hungry things do, when a name comes through to them, is begin to practice it. And then she said, that is why you do not say a name twice in a thin place. Not the same name, not in the same breath, not in the same hour, because the first time is how it hears the name, and the second time is how it learns your voice. She said this to Mosley in a plain kitchen on an October afternoon in 1906, And Mosley wrote it down and underlined the last two sentences and put a line in the margin. And then he wrote, in his own hand, below the transcript. She did not seem to be making this up. She seemed to be giving me instructions. Now, I need to tell you about a document I have not mentioned yet, because the timing matters. In the spring of 1869, 3 years before the events of this story, a woman in the next hollow over, the Falling Branch drainage on the east side of Sorrow Ridge, wrote a letter to her sister in Harrowfield. The letter was 22 pages, which is either a very long letter or a very desperate one, and it was never sent. It was found in a tobacco tin under the floor of a root cellar when the property was cleared in 1921, and the woman who found it brought it to the Historical Society in Harrowfield, and it sat in a cardboard box for 37 years until someone decided to catalog it. The woman who wrote it was named Dorothea Crane. She was 31 years old in the spring of 1869. She lived with her husband and 4 children on the Falling Branch side of Sorrow Ridge, directly on the other side of Widow's Cut from the Sorrow Creek Hollow. And she had been watching something happen to her oldest child for 6 months, starting in the fall of 1868. I am going to give you most of the letter. Eventually. Not yet. I want you to understand who Dorothea Crane was first, because she is the found document in this case, the previous witness, the one who walked into this before Cora did, the one whose experience, Cora's experience, rhymes with in ways that are not coincidence and are not explainable as coincidence. She is the voice in the journal, and her voice is different from everything else we have, because she was writing without the safety of distance. She was writing inside it. But her letter takes 20 minutes to read properly, and we are not there yet. There is more you need to know first. There is the matter of what was found in the cut during those 9 days. Not Ellen, not any trace of Ellen. Something else. On the 5th of November, 1872, the 3rd day of the search, a man named Silas Pruitt, part of the search party, found something on the west wall of the cut, about 8 feet up from the creek bed. He found it because the morning light caught it at an angle, and the angle made it visible when a straight-on look would not have. He called the other men over, and they looked at it together, and what they saw was this: names, cut into the limestone, not scratched, cut with something with a good edge into the surface of the rock, in letters about 2 inches high. A column of them, running vertically down the wall from about 10 feet to about 3 feet off the ground. Mosley estimates, from the descriptions of the 2 men on the recovery party who told him about it, roughly 30 names, possibly more, because the lower part of the column was in shadow, and neither man wanted to get close enough to see all of it clearly. What they could see from a safe distance was enough. The top several names were in a style of lettering that both men described as old. Not old in the sense of damaged or weathered, but old in the sense of formed differently from the way they formed letters, using the older shapes for certain letters that had been replaced in common usage by newer forms sometime in the previous century. Mosley concluded from this, and I think correctly, that the top of the column predated the living memory of anyone in the hollow. The bottom of the column, the newest names, cut shallower and lighter, were in a style of lettering that one of the 2 men said was familiar. He said, in the Mosley transcript, "I have seen that hand before. I went home that night and I thought about where I had seen it, and then I knew, and then I did not sleep." Mosley asked him whose hand it was. He would not say. He said, "I will not put that name in your book. You write that I recognize the hand, and you write that I will not say whose it is, and let anyone who is willing to think hard about it come to their own conclusion." Mosley did write it that way. And the conclusion is not difficult. There are 2 people in this story who went into that cut and did not come back the way they went in. One of them, as of November of 1872, had not come back at all. And the names cut into the walls of Widow's Cut, in a column that went from older than memory down to fresh and pale and new, suggest that whoever or whatever the cut was collecting had been collecting for a very long time, and that in the fall of 1872 it was still adding names in someone's hand to a list that had been started on a wall of limestone before any European person had set foot in that hollow. I want to say one more thing about the names on the wall before I move on, and this is the thing I find hardest to carry. The county coroner's inquiry in January of 1873 included the testimony of Alton Shade, the justice of the peace who had led the search. Shade said that on the day the names were found, he sent a man back down to the hollow for a piece of chalk, and he chalked around each name to make them easier to read, and that he counted them. He said he counted 38 names, with some possible additions in the shadow at the bottom that he could not reach safely. He said he did not recognize any of the names in the upper portion of the column. He said he recognized 2 names in the lower portion. The coroner asked him to name them. Shade said the first was a child from the far end of the hollow who had gone missing in the summer of 1859, before the war, and had never been found. He said the second name was Ellen Vess. The coroner asked when he thought Ellen's name had been added. Shade said, "It was not there in May. I went through the cut in May on my way to the Falling Branch side, and I would have noticed. So it was added between May and early November. And the stone around it was white, fresh cut. The stone around it had not had time to weather." No one in that inquiry asked the obvious question, and I think everyone in the room knew why, which is that the obvious question was, who cut it in, and with what? And when was Ellen Vess still in a position to do anything at all? No one asked it. Shade was allowed to step down. The inquiry concluded in February of 1873 with a finding of disappearance under unknown circumstances, and the case was closed, and Widow's Cut was left alone, and the names on the wall were not touched again by anyone living, not anyone who admitted to it, anyway. Now, the 9 days as Cora experienced them. I told you the composition book was 11 pages. That is not quite right. It is 11 pages of a composition book that has 16 leaves, meaning the last 5 pages are blank, meaning Cora stopped writing at a point that she chose and did not go further. The 11 pages of text are written in a hand that Hattie Dunmore described in 1958 as too even, and I think what she meant is that it never wavers, that there is no evidence of the emotion you would expect from a child writing down the worst 9 days of her life, that the letters are all the same size and the same slant throughout, from the first word to the last, and that the effect of this is not the calm of a child at peace, but the calm of a child who has decided that the only safe thing she can do with what she knows is be precise about it, and let the precision be cold enough to handle. She was right about that. In 61 more years of life, she never spoke of it. The precision was the vessel. The composition book was the lock. I am going to read you the book in sections, in the order she wrote it, and I am going to read you the whole of what she wrote before I add anything of my own. She wrote in the voice of a child, and I am going to honor that voice by not improving it. When she says things that are hard to understand, we will sit with them. When she says things that are terrible, I am not going to soften them. She wrote them down at 11 years old so that they could be read by someone who needed them, and the someone who needs them tonight is you. She begins, "I am writing this because I told Daddy I would not tell anybody what happened, and I told Mama the same thing, and I told the preacher when he came that I had nothing to say about it, and all of those things are true because I am not telling anybody. I am writing it. I do not think writing is the same as telling, because telling is putting something in the air where it can be heard again, and writing is putting something on paper where it stays. I might be wrong about that. Ellen would know. Ellen always knew which things were the same, and which things only looked the same, and those are not the same thing either. She begins by explaining the distinction between telling and writing. She is 11 years old, and she has already understood something about the nature of voice that takes most people their whole lives to consider. The thing in the cut cares about what goes into the air. She already knows this. She knows it before she writes a single word of what happened, because understanding it is the reason she is writing instead of speaking. She continues, I went up to the cut on the 4th of November, which was the second day Ellen had been gone. I went up because I thought I knew where she was. I did not tell Daddy or Mama, because Daddy had already been up twice, and he had not found anything, and I thought the reason he had not found anything was that he was looking for something you could see, and I thought Ellen might be somewhere you could not see unless you already knew to look. That sounds like I was being a foolish child, and maybe I was. Ellen always said I was not foolish. I was only very fast, and that being very fast is a kind of foolishness that does not know it is foolish yet. I thought about that a lot in the 9 days. And here I want to stop and give you something, because that sentence, I thought about that a lot in the 9 days, is the first sentence in the composition book that tells you something happened in those 9 days that Cora spent thinking, not waiting, not surviving. Thinking. She was in some kind of circumstance for 9 days, and she spent them thinking. And I want you to hold that because when we get to what the circumstance was, you are going to need to remember that a specific, quick-minded 11-year-old was present in it with all of her faculties, and that what she reports is not the report of a child in shock, but the report of a child who was, in some essential way, working. She continues, When I got to the bottom of the cut, it was about 10 in the morning, and the sun was already above the west wall, so the whole inside of the cut had good light. I went in at the south end, and I walked the whole length. 30 yards is not very long. It took me less than a minute. There was nothing in the creek bed. The walls were limestone, and there were cracks in them that were bigger than I remembered from the summer, and the cracks smelled like cold, which is what the inside of limestone smells like in November, and it smelled the way it always did. What it did not sound like was the usual way. Here is what I mean by that. A narrow cut in a ridge acts like a pipe for sound. You put a sound into one end, and it comes out at the other end, changed by traveling through the stone, the way water comes out of a pipe tasting of whatever the pipe is made of. The usual sound in the cut was the sound of the hollow below and the falling branch side above, pushed through 30 yards of stone and mixed together, wind and birds, and if the creek was running, then the creek. It was never quiet in the cut, but it was never loud. It was a middle sound. When I walked into it on the morning of the 4th of November, it was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that is the absence of sound. The kind of quiet that is the presence of listening. She is 11 years old. And I need you to sit with that sentence the way I have sat with it, because it is the most precise description of this particular variety of wrongness that I have encountered in any of the accounts of any of the cases I have spent time with, and it is written by a child, in pencil, in a composition book she kept hidden under a quilt for most of a century. The presence of listening, not silence, attention. The thing in the cut was already attending to her before she understood there was a thing in the cut. She continues, I was at the middle of the passage when I saw the names on the wall. I should say I had not heard about the names yet, because the search party did not find them until the next day, and I was already inside by then. I saw them, and I looked at them, and I saw that they went from old at the top to new at the bottom, and I saw that the newest one was in a hand I knew. I want to say plainly that seeing that name was the worst thing I have ever seen, and I think is the worst thing I will ever see, and I am going to write it here only once. I saw Ellen's name on the wall of Widow's Cut in Ellen's hand, and it was freshly cut, and the stone dust from it was still on the ground below it, and it had not been there the summer before. I looked at it for a long time. Then I said her name out loud, because I thought if she had been there and cut her name, she might be close enough to hear me call. I said her name once. Then I said it a second time, and something answered. I am going to stop the composition book there for a moment, not because I intend to spare you anything, but because I think you need to understand, before we go any further, what Cora was walking toward when she walked into the cut that morning. She was 11. She had been in the cut many times. She had no warning and no preparation and no set of instructions from anyone wiser than herself. She had only what she knew, which was that her sister was missing, and what she was, which was quick and precise and not, as her sister had noted, foolish in any ordinary sense. She said the name once, and then she said it a second time, and something answered. I want to tell you what answered her, and what it said, and what happened for the next 9 days, and I am going to tell you all of it, slowly, the way she wrote it. But before I do that, I want to take a moment and step back and tell you something about the shape of what we are dealing with, because the shape of it is the most important thing, and the shape is something Cora understood by the end of those 9 days better than anyone else ever has. The thing in Widow's Cut was not a ghost. Cora does not call it a ghost, and I am not going to call it one either, because a ghost is a thing that was a person and is now something else. And what was in the cut appears to have never been a person in the first place. It was something that had been in that limestone long enough to have learned a great deal about people by listening to them pass through, the way a wall in a house knows everything that is said in the rooms on either side of it. It had been listening for a very long time. It had been practicing for a very long time, and what it had been practicing for longer than anyone in the hollow had been alive was names. Nettie Furl said, "What hungry things do, when a name comes through to them, is begin to practice it." Cora Vess, at 11 years old, in a limestone passage in November, gave it 2 chances to practice Ellen's name in Ellen's sister's voice. And then she found out, in the way that you find out things in a narrow cut in a ridge when you are 11 and alone and a long way from help, exactly what it did with that practice. She continues, the answer came from inside the wall. Not from far away and not from outside the cut. It came from inside the limestone on the east side, the side with the names on it, and it was the way sound comes out of a wall when someone on the other side of the wall is speaking, which is that you hear the right sounds, but they come at you through something instead of through the air, so that the surfaces of the sounds are wrong, even though the interior of them is right. If you have ever heard someone you love speaking in the next room through a closed door, you know what I mean. You know it is them. You know the voice, but the door is in it. What I heard was my sister's name. In my voice, the way I say it, with the way I drop the second syllable, a little which Ellen always made fun of me for. It was so close to the way I say her name that for 1 full second I thought I was hearing an echo. The way you hear an echo in a hollow when you call and the hillside sends your voice back to you. I thought, it is only an echo, and then the echo said something else. It said, "Thank you." That is the first thing the composition book records the thing in the cut saying. Not Ellen's name, not Cora's name. Thank you. 2 words in Cora's voice, which it had just heard for the second time when she called her sister's name twice, and which it had been practicing with, apparently, in the few seconds since. 2 words in her voice, and it chose those 2 words, and I have spent time with that choice, and the more I think about it, the more deliberate it seems, because those 2 words are the correct response to a gift, and what Cora had just given it was a gift, and it knew that, and it wanted her to know that it knew. She continues, I stood very still. I did not say anything. I did not know what to say, and I was afraid that anything I said would be another gift. I thought about turning around and going back out the south end, but I was afraid that moving quickly would tell it something. I thought about Ellen. I thought about Ellen's name on the wall in Ellen's hand, and what that meant about where Ellen was, and I thought, I am the only person who is going to come in here who might be able to find her, and if I leave now, I will have to live with having left. So I stayed, and I started to count. She started to count. In the dark and cold of a limestone passage, alone, 11 years old, with something in the walls that had just said thank you in her voice, Cora Vess started to count. Not as a ritual, not because someone told her to. She said later, in the composition book, that she started counting because counting is the thing she did when she needed to know where she was and could not look, the way some people use breathing or prayer. Counting is Cora's rope back to herself. And in that passage, with the thing in the walls attending to her, she counted to keep herself. She counted to 100. Then she started over. By the time she reached 200, she had a plan. She writes, "The plan was this. A thing that is hungry for names will not hurt the person who has names to give it. It needs me to keep speaking. It needs my voice, which means it needs me to be alive and present and willing to speak, which means that for as long as I am willing to speak, I am safe, which also means that the moment I stop speaking or the moment I try to leave, the calculation changes. So I needed to find out what it wanted before I tried to leave, and I needed to find out if Ellen was reachable, and I needed to do both of those things while keeping it fed enough to keep it patient, without feeding it anything I could not afford to lose." She is 11 years old. I want to keep saying that because it is easy to forget it when the logic is this clean. She continues, "The first thing I fed it was my own name. I said it once, on purpose, clearly, the way you put a coin on a table instead of dropping it. I said, 'I am Cora.' I said it like an introduction, which it was. And then I waited." The wall said, after a pause she estimates at about 30 seconds, "Cora," in her voice. Exactly. She said the similarity was absolute, that if she had heard it without knowing the circumstances, she could not have told it from herself, and she was old enough to understand what that meant and what it implied about what had happened to Ellen's voice. She continues, "I said yes. I said it once. I did not say I am yes, or yes, that is me, or any of the things I might have said if I was answering a person, because I understood by then that every word was going to be examined and used, and I did not want to give it the shape of a full sentence any faster than I had to. Yes. One word. I said yes. The wall said, 'You are looking for Ellen,' in her voice, which means it had already been practicing her voice enough to build sentences with it, using the raw material she had given it in those 2 calls of her sister's name. It could not have done that in 30 seconds of practice on a new voice, which means it had been hearing her voice and Ellen's voice, and the voices of everyone who had come through that passage for years, maybe longer, and it had a great deal more practice material than just the 2 calls she had given it that morning. It said, 'You are looking for Ellen,' and Cora said, 'Yes,' and the wall said, 'Ellen is here.' Now, I want to stop the composition book there again and give you a moment with those 3 words, because they are the hinge of the entire story, and everything that happened in the 9 days turned on them, and the shape of the case, and the reason Cora came out alive, and the reason she kept the rule for 61 years, all of it is in those 3 words. Ellen is here. Not come and find her. Not Ellen is gone. Not I have her. Here. Present tense. Immediate. A statement of location, not of condition. The thing in the wall said Ellen was there, in the cut, in some way that the word here applied to, and it said this without Cora asking, and it said this in Cora's own voice. And the accuracy of the voice and the directness of the statement together were calibrated, whether or not they were calculated, to do exactly one thing to an 11-year-old girl who had walked into a limestone passage to find her missing sister. They were calibrated to make her stay. She stayed. She stayed for 9 days, and I am going to take you through what those 9 days were, slowly, Because the 9 days are not a horror story in any ordinary sense, and they will not feel like one if I tell them honestly. They feel, when you read the composition book, like a negotiation, a very long, very careful negotiation between a child with one resource, which was language, and a thing that wanted that resource and was willing to trade for it. What it was trading was Ellen, or what it said was Ellen. Cora, from the very first day, was not certain those were the same thing. She continues, I could not see Ellen. I could hear what the thing told me was Ellen, which is different. When I asked where Ellen was, the thing said she is in the rock. I did not know what to do with that. I asked if Ellen could hear me, and the thing said yes. And I asked why Ellen did not speak to me, and the thing said, Ellen is learning how. I understood then that Ellen was not going to be able to speak to me the way a person speaks, and I did not ask more about that for 3 days because I was afraid of what the answer might be, and I needed to be able to keep thinking clearly. She understood that she needed to stay able to think clearly, and she managed it for 9 days, and I want to tell you how. Because it is the central, practical fact of the composition book, and it is more remarkable than anything supernatural in this entire account. She ate the apples. When she went into the cut that morning, she had 2 apples in her coat pockets, Vess yellows from the remains of the harvest, carried as a habit rather than as provision. She ate them over the first 2 days, in small bites, rationing without being sure she needed to ration, which is the correct instinct. She drank from a seep in the north wall of the cut that ran even in November because it came from deep in the limestone. She slept in the creek bed, on her coat, with her back against the south wall, for short periods, waking at irregular intervals, never sleeping long enough to be deeply asleep. She counted while she was awake. She said the multiplication tables under her breath when she felt herself starting to drift away from herself, not into sleep but into the particular softness that she recognized as the thing working on her, working on the edges of herself the way water works on the edges of stone, not visibly and not fast, but persistently and without stopping. She wrote, The counting and the multiplication were not to keep me company. They were to keep me. I am Cora Vess. I am 11 years old. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. I am at Widow's Cut on Sorrow Ridge. 2 times 4 is 8. I went in on the 4th of November. 2 times 5 is 10. My father's name is Harlan Vess. My mother's name is Prudence Vess. My sister's name is. And here the composition book does something that I have not been able to forget since I read the description of it. The sentence stops there. My sister's name is. And then, in what appears to be slightly larger letters than the surrounding text, occupying the space where the name would go, there is a single dash, just a dash, a mark in the space where a name should be. And then the writing continues. I said it in my head, and not on paper, and not out loud. My sister's name is dash. She had understood, by the first day, not to write the name twice in the same document, not to put it in the air. She had understood the rule she would keep for 61 years before she had been in that passage for 24 hours, and she understood it well enough to apply it to writing, not just speech. That is not a child following instructions. That is a child who has reasoned her way to a principle and applied it across categories. I am Cora Vess. I am 11 years old. My sister's name is Dash. Now I want to give you the middle days, days 3 through 6, because those are the days when the negotiation takes its shape, and the shape of it is important. I am going to move through the composition book quickly here and slow down again at the end, because the end is where the weight is. Days 3 and 4 are the days Cora spent trying to understand what the thing in the wall was and what it wanted, and the way she did this was to ask questions, carefully, in short sentences, and listen to the answers, and write them down on the end papers of the composition book, which she had in her coat pocket. She always carried the composition book. She had started it the previous September, as a record of things she wanted to learn, a running list of questions and answers, a habit her father had encouraged. She had been using it to record facts about the apple varieties and the drying times, and which varieties kept best in which conditions, and the last entry before the ones about the cut is a note about the russet and how long it could be stored before it lost its firmness, and then the next entry is, Day 1. The wall has a voice. She was very matter-of-fact about this. I say this not to suggest she was unafraid, but to accurately characterize her method, which was to treat the situation as a problem to be understood rather than a terror to be survived. And this distinction is, I believe, the whole reason she is alive, to have a daughter who finds a composition book under a quilt in 1958. What she learned in days 3 and 4, the thing in the wall could not leave the passage. It said so. Without being asked directly, she had been thinking about whether it could follow her if she ran, and she had started to frame a question about it, and before she could ask it, the wall said, I do not go out. This told her two things. It told her there was some limit to where the thing could operate, and it told her the thing could hear her thinking, at least partially, at least sometimes. She was more careful after that about the content of her thoughts. She started doing arithmetic in her head as a screen. What she learned in days 3 and 4 continued. The thing had no consistent name for itself and did not appear to want one. When she asked what to call it, the wall was silent for a long time and then said, in her voice, What calls you back? She wrote this down and thought about it for the rest of that day. She decided it meant that the thing understood itself as a kind of answering service. It was whatever answered when a name was called twice in that passage. It was the call's return. It was the calling back. What she learned in days 3 and 4 continued, and this is the part that altered the shape of the negotiation. On the 4th day, she finally asked directly about Ellen. She asked, Is Ellen in the wall the way the names are in the wall? Or is she in the wall the way a person can be in a room? And the wall was quiet for a long time, much longer than usual, and then it said, Ellen went further in. Ellen went further in, she wrote. I held very still when it said that, and I thought about what further in meant. I thought about whether it meant Ellen was dead. Because if Ellen was dead, then what I was negotiating for did not exist, and I needed to know that, and I needed to know it in a way that I could keep functioning after knowing it. I sat with that possibility for a long time. Then I decided it did not mean Ellen was dead, because a dead person does not go further in. A dead person goes somewhere, but they do not go in, because in implies a container, and the dead are not in containers. They are past containers. Ellen went further in meant Ellen had gone somewhere that still had a direction to it, and direction means the possibility of coming back out. She is 11 years old, and she is thinking about the nature of death and the geometry of disappearance in a limestone cut in November, and she is thinking clearly, and I want you to understand how much clearness that took and at what cost, because by the 5th day, she had been in the cut for 4 days on 2 apples and creek water and snatched sleep. And the thing in the wall had been working on the edges of her mind for 4 days. And she was still doing multiplication tables to keep herself. And she was still clear. On the 5th day she made her offer. She writes, I understood by then that the thing wanted voices. Specifically, it wanted new voices it had not heard before, and for those voices to speak names, because a name spoken by a voice is the richest material, more than a voice alone and more than a name written, and it wanted them in the passage where it could take them in cleanly. And I understood that I had been giving it my voice for 4 days, and it had not tried to harm me or prevent me from leaving, which meant it was still hoping I would give it more. I was, I thought, worth more to it alive and speaking than any other way. So I made the offer. I said, I will come back, after I am out. I will come back, and I will bring people, and I will let them pass through the cut, and you will hear all their names and all their voices. I will do that if you let me and Ellen out. The wall said, You will bring them willingly. I said yes. The wall said, And you will not tell them, she writes. I understood what it was asking. It was asking me not to warn the people I brought through. It was asking me to let them walk in unknowing, the way Ellen and I had walked in unknowing, the way the 38 names on the wall had walked in unknowing. It was asking me to make a choice about other people that I did not have the right to make, and it was offering me Ellen in exchange for that choice, and I knew, sitting there in the creek bed with my back against the cold stone, that it had made this offer before, that every person whose name was on that wall had been inside the passage first, and had been given some version of this offer, and had said no or had said yes, and it had not worked out for them either way. She writes, I said, I will come back. That is all I will promise, and then I will see. And the wall said nothing, and Cora counted. And sometime on the morning of the 6th day, something changed in the quality of the silence in the passage. She writes, On the morning of the 6th day the silence changed. It had been the silence of attention, the presence of listening that I had noticed on the first day. On the 6th morning, it became the silence of something thinking. The attention was still there, but there was something behind it working, and the feeling was not unlike the feeling of being in a room with a person who is working out a difficult sum, where the person is present and also absent, fully occupied with the work and not available to you in the usual way. I sat with that for most of the day. I counted. I said the multiplication tables. I thought about my father's face. I thought about the apples, and whether the russets were in the cold cellar yet. I thought about my mother's hands, and what they felt like when she checked my forehead for fever, the way the back of a hand is cooler than the palm, and she always used the back. I kept thinking about small and specific things, because I had learned that the thing worked on you through the general and the abstract, and that the particular and the small were harder for it. It could give you the feeling of being lost. It could not replicate the exact particular coolness of the back of your mother's hand checking for fever. That is her survival method. Not prayer, not ritual. The specific and the small. The back of a hand. The russets in the cold cellar. The multiplication tables. Cora Vess survived 9 days in Widow's Cut by being as particular and material and grounded as possible at every moment, and by treating abstraction in any form as a door the thing could come through. On the 7th day, the wall made a new sound. She writes, I want to describe this as precisely as I can because I think this is the most important thing I am going to write down in here. On the morning of the 7th day, the wall made a sound I had not heard before. It was not a voice. It was not a word. It was more like what you hear when you put your ear against the trunk of a large tree in the wind, which is the wind moving through the tree from the inside, through the channels and the grain, coming out through the bark at a different pitch and character than it went in as. A sound being processed through something. But what was being processed was not wind. It was a held note, low and sustained and with no tune in it at all, coming through the east wall of the cut, and then through the west wall as well, both walls at once, as though whatever was making the sound was big enough to be in both walls simultaneously, which I suppose it was, the held note. The single sustained low sound with no tune in it, Ellen's thinking sound. There is a moment in the composition book where the handwriting changes. Not in style, the letters stay the same, in pressure. Hattie Dunmore described it to the Historical Society in 1958 as the place where the pencil went harder into the paper, and she said she had not noticed it on her first reading and had only seen it when she held the page up to a window and looked at the impressions from the back. 3 lines, maybe 4, where the pressure increased, and then it returns to the even hand. In those 3 or 4 lines, Cora writes, I listened to the thinking sound come through the wall for a long time. I was not frightened. I want to say I was not frightened because it is true, and because I want the record to be accurate. What I was the closest thing to sad that I have ever been, which is a kind of sad that has no water in it, no crying, just a hard and dry heaviness like the limestone pressing in, the weight of understanding something that you cannot fix. I knew what the sound meant. It meant the thing had practiced the thinking sound and practiced it long enough to give it back to me through the wall. It meant the thing had been in the passage with Ellen long enough to learn the thinking sound. It meant Ellen had been in the wall long enough for the thing to learn her the way it had spent longer than living memory learning the people who walked through. And then she writes, I said her name, once. I said it clearly. And I said it directly at the east wall, where the sound was coming from, and I said it in the voice I have always used for her, which is a little different from my usual voice. A little gentler, the way you use a different voice for the people you love than you use for anyone else. And I waited. The thinking sound stopped, and then, from a place so close to the east wall that it seemed to come from just on the other side of the stone, in a voice that was Ellen's but that had the stone in it, the door in its sound that the thing's voice had, came a single word, Cora, she writes. I said, I am here. I said it once, and the thing that had Ellen's voice in it and the stone in it said, I know. And then it was quiet, and I was quiet, and we sat there on either side of the wall for a long time. I understood that this was as close as I was going to get to her. I understood that the thing had put the sound through as a demonstration, to show me what it had, to show me what the trade would be. I understood that Ellen was in the wall, and that the wall had her so well that it could produce her thinking sound and her voice. And I believed, sitting there, that if it could produce those things, it might be able to produce more. I believed it might be able to produce Ellen. I also understood something else. The voice I heard, Ellen's voice filtered through the stone, said my name, Cora. It said it once, it did not say it twice. And Ellen was inside whatever had been practicing the rules of that passage for longer than anyone alive could remember, and the thing in the passage practiced everything, and one of the things it had been practicing from Ellen was the rule about names, which meant Ellen had told the rule to whatever had her, which meant Ellen was still herself enough to know the rule and to teach it, even inside the wall. Ellen was still there. Ellen was still Ellen. Ellen had told the rule into the stone. That is the moment the composition book changes in pressure, because that is the moment Cora understood that she was not negotiating for a recording of her sister. She was negotiating for a person who was still, in some form, present, and who had been in there long enough to understand what she was in, and had spent that time trying to leave a way out. On the 8th day, Cora stopped talking. She writes, On the 8th day, I had been in the passage for 7 days, and I had given the thing my name and my voice, and I had given it my sister's name twice on the first day. I had given it quite a lot. I decided to give it nothing on the 8th day, not from anger and not from despair, because I needed to understand something, and the only way to understand it was from the quality of the silence when I was not speaking. I needed to know if it would wait. It waited. The whole 8th day, from light to dark, in silence, with the thing in the wall attending to her, and she gave it nothing, not a word, not a count, and she ate nothing because there was nothing left to eat, and she drank from the seep, and she counted in her head without making a sound, and at the end of the day she understood that it would wait as long as she was there, which told her something critical. It would wait, which meant it did not consider her going anywhere, which meant it believed she could not leave, which meant she could leave, because a thing that genuinely could prevent you from leaving does not think about waiting. Only a thing that believes it has already convinced you to stay thinks in terms of patience. It thought it had already won. It had been in that passage for longer than living memory, and everyone whose name was on the wall had either given up or given in. And it assumed she would too, because everyone always had, and she was 11 years old. And 11-year-old girls do not reason their way out of limestone hollows, she writes. On the 9th day I stood up and I said, I am going out now. I said it once. I did not say please. I said it as a statement, the wall said, in her voice. Now with a quality she describes as something like alarm, though she is careful to say she is not certain the thing was capable of alarm in any human sense. You will come back, she said. Yes, I will come back, she writes. That was not a lie. I intended to come back. I did not tell it what I intended to do when I came back, and it did not ask, because it was not accustomed to people leaving and did not have a framework for asking questions about it. I walked to the south end of the passage. I did not run. I walked with my back straight and my hands at my sides, and I counted my steps. 14 steps to the end. I stepped out into the morning light on the south side. The light outside was different from what she remembered. Not brighter, different in character, she says. The way the light in a room is different after you have been outside for a long time and come back in, as though the world outside had a different color temperature than the world inside the passage. She stood in the November sun for a long time and let her eyes adjust, and then she walked down the track to the hollow and arrived at the fence in time to be carried in by her father before the light had fully come. She had been inside for 9 days. She had come out alone, and this is the thing that takes up the last 3 pages of the composition book, and the thing that I have been carrying since I read the account of it. She came out alone. Ellen did not come out with her, and the composition book, in its last 3 pages, which are the pages that required the most precision and the most courage to write, contains Cora's explanation of why. She writes, People will want to know why I did not bring Ellen out. I have been thinking about how to explain this since the day I came out, and I am going to do my best. Ellen was in the wall. I heard her voice come through the stone on the 7th day, but hearing a voice through stone is not the same as the person being reachable through stone. I could hear her. I could not get to her. The thing in the wall could put her sound through. It could not or would not put her through. And the offer it made me, you will bring others, and you will not warn them, was not an offer to give Ellen back. It was an offer to give me something that had Ellen's voice and Ellen's thinking sound. The thing that came to the fence at Nettie Furl's house on the 3rd night of the 9 days was about the size of a 13-year-old girl. I did not know about the fence visit when I was in the passage. I learned it later. But I knew, sitting in the creek bed, that the thing could produce something that looked and sounded like Ellen, the way a mold can produce something that looks and feels like the original, and I knew that bringing people through without warning them was what it wanted me to do, not in order to give Ellen back, but in order to get more names, and that the Ellen-shaped thing it would give me afterward would be useful to it forever as a way of keeping me coming back to bring more people. So here is what I decided. I decided to leave. I decided to leave, and I decided not to bring anyone else through. I decided that the thing in the wall would have to wait for its names. I decided that I would carry the rule instead of the warning, because a rule is something I can pass on without explanation, and the explanation itself is dangerous, in a way I cannot fully put into words, except to say that explaining it means speaking the name more than once, and I had already made that mistake once, and I was not going to make it again. And I decided that I would grieve Ellen the way my mother grieves the children she lost, which is privately and without outside evidence, and with the full force of it turned inward, where only I can see it, she writes. In the last line of the last page of writing in the composition book, I believe Ellen is still in the wall. I believe she is still herself in there, as much as she can be. I believe she is still thinking. And I believe that the worst thing I could do for her is to let the thing in the wall use her as a door. So I will not. I will keep the rule. And I will keep her name the way she would keep it, which is like a thing she has put down while she figures out where it has gone to think about things. I will keep it safe until she needs it back. And then the composition book stops. 11 pages. The last 5 are blank. Now I want to give you the Dorothea Crane letter. I promised it at the beginning, and I have been keeping it back because you needed to understand the composition book first, and now you do. Dorothea Crane was a woman who lived on the Falling Branch side of Sorrow Ridge, on the other side of the cut from the Sorrow Creek Hollow, and she wrote 22 pages in the spring of 1869, 3 years before Cora Vess went into the cut. She wrote about her oldest child, and the letter was never sent. Her oldest child was a boy named Thomas, who was 11 years old in the fall of 1868. He had been through Widow's Cut many times. It was the short route between the Falling Branch drainage and the Sorrow Creek side, and the Crane family used it the way all the families on the east face used it, routinely, without ceremony. Thomas had been through it alone, and with his father, and with his younger siblings. Nothing had happened, nothing unusual, until the fall of 1868, Dorothea writes. In the letter, in October, Thomas began to speak differently. I do not mean his manner of speaking. He spoke in the same manner and in the same voice, and he used the same words he had always used. What was different was the quality of attention he brought to it. He began to listen to himself speak in a way he had not done before, the way a person listens who is checking the sound of something against a memory of it, as though he was hearing his own voice from a slight distance and checking its accuracy. I noticed it in October, and I did not say anything because I did not know what to say. By November, he had a new habit. Before he answered any question that required him to name someone, he would pause. A full pause, not a child searching for words, but a pause with the quality of decision in it, and then he would answer. And the answer was always the name once, just once, flatly and plainly, with no decoration or context, as though he was using the minimum possible word to satisfy the requirement of the question and no more. She writes, "My husband Elbert said the boy was being rude. I did not think he was being rude. I thought he was being careful. I did not know what he was being careful about. I asked him once in November, when Elbert was in the field. I said, 'Thomas, why do you not say a name more than once?' And he looked at me with the look children sometimes have when they have understood something that the adults around them have not, and he said, 'You should not do that, Mama.' He said, 'You should only say a name once in the same breath, or it hears you twice.'" She writes, "I asked him what hears you. He did not answer that. I asked if he had been up to the cut recently, and he said yes. And I asked if something had happened there, and he said no. Nothing happened. I only listened. He said, 'There is something in the wall up there that has been listening for a very long time, and it knows a great many names, and it can say them back in the voice of whoever said them.' He said, 'It is very good at names. It has been practicing for a very long time.' I said, 'Have you been talking to it?' He said, 'No, Mama. I have been listening to it.'" Thomas Crane had been going to the cut, not to cross it, but to sit at the entrance and listen to whatever came out of the stone. He had been doing this since early October. He had been going there alone and sitting at the south entrance, on the outside, and listening, and he had apparently heard enough in those weeks to understand a great deal about what the thing in the passage was and what it wanted. He understood, without being told, that you did not go inside. He understood without being told that you did not speak names in there. He had worked those things out from the outside, by listening, without ever going in. Dorothea writes, I asked him how long this had been going on, and he said since he found the knife. And here I want to be very precise with you, because this is the detail that connects the Crane family account to the Vess account in a way that I did not understand until the third time I read both documents, and that, I think, changes the shape of the whole case. Thomas Crane found a paring knife at the south entrance to the cut, lying on the limestone gravel just inside the passage, in early October of 1868, a good paring knife. A kitchen knife, well made, with a carved wood handle and a blade that had been kept. He picked it up and brought it home, and his mother recognized it as a knife from the Sorrow Creek side, from a family she knew, though she could not say exactly which family, only that she had seen that handle before. She put the knife in a drawer and forgot about it, until she was writing the letter in the spring of 1869. And then she wrote, "I wonder, writing this now, whether that knife is what started all of it? Whether Thomas would have stopped at the entrance and listened if he had not had a reason to go to the entrance in the first place, whether whoever lost the knife is connected to this in a way I cannot yet see." She never finished the letter. It stops in the middle of a sentence on page 22. The sentence is, "I have been watching Thomas for 6 months, and in that time he has not gone back to the cut, and he has been himself in every way that I can measure, except for the way he says names and the way he," and then it stops. I do not know what happened in the spring of 1869. There is no further record of the Crane family in the Caldwell County documents I have access to. The property on the Falling Branch side was cleared in 1921, which is when the letter was found in the root cellar, and the people who cleared it were not Cranes and did not know the family history. Whoever finds this letter to Dorothea's sister in Harrowfield is Dorothea herself, hiding it under a root cellar floor in a tobacco tin, which is not the action of someone who has decided everything is fine. But Thomas's account, filtered through Dorothea's letter, tells us something that Cora's account cannot tell us, which is what the thing in the cut sounds like from the outside. Thomas sat at the entrance for weeks and listened and learned, without going in, without giving the thing his voice. He had the only risk-free education in the passage's nature that appears in any of the records. And what he told his mother is what I want you to carry for the rest of tonight. He said it has been practicing for a very long time. He said it is very good at names. And he said, "You should only say a name once in the same breath, or it hears you twice." That is the rule. Not Cora's rule. Not a rule invented in grief or in the aftermath of trauma. A rule deduced from observation by a child sitting at the outside of a limestone passage, listening to a thing that had been practicing names and voices for longer than any living person in that hollow could account for. He worked it out. 3 years before Cora went in, a boy on the other side of the ridge had already worked out the rule, and the rule was not, "Don't go in." The rule was, "Don't say a name twice," because the first time is how it hears the name, and the second time is how it learns your voice. Now, let me tell you what Nettie Furl told Edmund Garrett Mosley in the last of the 9 pages in October of 1906. I have been holding this back because this is the section of the transcript that matters most and that does not appear in any other account, and I wanted you to have the composition book and the Crane letter before you heard it, because you need both of those to understand what Nettie Furl is saying when she says it. Mosley writes, "She was quiet for a while, and then she said she wanted to tell me the one thing she had never told anyone because she was old and it needed to be somewhere other than inside her own head. She said, 'I went back to the cut once, after the Vess girl came out, after the inquiry was closed, in the spring of '73, when the road was good. I went by myself, like I went the first time, early in the morning, and I stood at the south end and I listened,' she said. The names on the wall had not changed. The new ones were still there. There were no new ones. But the count was wrong. In the autumn I had counted, from the south end, as many as I could see, 30-some names. The column. In the spring I went back and I looked, and the count was different. There were more. Mosley asked her how many more. She said, "I did not want to know exactly. I looked long enough to understand that the column was longer than it had been, and then I left, and I have not been back." Mosley asked, "Did you hear anything from inside?" She was quiet again, and then she said, "Yes. I heard a voice, coming from well inside the passage. A girl's voice, I think. It was saying something over and over, in a low voice, not loudly, in a measured way, like a person counting. It sounded like the multiplication tables." She said, "I listened for a moment, and then I left, because I thought, whoever is in there is still all right. Whoever is in there is still themselves, and I was not going to do anything that might interrupt what they were doing to stay that way. I want to stop here and step back for a moment, because I have just told you something that the composition book does not account for, and you deserve to sit with that before I go on. Cora Vess came out of the cut on the morning of the 12th of November, 1872. Nettie Furl went back to the cut in the spring of 1873, let us say April, 5 months later, and heard a voice inside the passage saying the multiplication tables. Cora Vess was at home by April of 1873. She had been at home since November. She was sitting in her family's house on Sorrow Creek, eating and sleeping and going to school, and she had a rule about her sister's name, and she was, by all accounts, quiet and steady, and exactly who she had always been. So whoever was saying the multiplication tables in the cut in the spring of 1873, it was not Cora. Let me sit with that with you for a moment, because I think you need the same moment I needed when I understood it. The voice was a girl's voice. It was low and measured, and it was saying the multiplication tables. Those three things are precise enough to mean something. Cora Vess said the multiplication tables to stay herself. She said it in the composition book, explicitly. She called it the thing she did when she felt herself starting to drift away from herself. The multiplication tables were her anchor, her rope back. And in April of 1873, Nettie Furl heard a girl's voice in the passage saying, "The multiplication tables, I have two possible ways to understand this, and I am going to give you both of them and let you decide which one you can live with. The first is that the thing in the wall had been in the cut with Cora for 9 days and had learned the multiplication tables from her, the way it had learned her voice and her sister's name, and was saying them back in a girl's voice as a kind of practice or play or exploration, the way it had sent the thinking sound through the wall on the 7th day. This would mean the thing in the wall says the multiplication tables the way it says anything else, with the voice and the manner of whoever it learned them from as pure mimicry, as the practice of a name-hungry thing that has absorbed a survival strategy without understanding that it is a survival strategy. The second is that Ellen Vess had learned the multiplication tables from her sister, through the stone, during those 9 days, and was saying them in the spring of 1873, in April, 5 months after Cora left, still in the passage, still counting, still doing the thing she had been taught from the other side of the wall to keep herself. If you are still with me this deep into the dark, put a candle in the comments. I want to see how far we have come together. And if you have been meaning to hit subscribe and have not done it yet, this is the moment. It is free, and it means the next case finds you. I will not tell you which one I believe, because I do not think belief is the right category for something like this. I will tell you that Nettie Furl listened to the voice for a moment and then left, because she thought whoever was in there was still all right. She said still themselves. She thought the voice sounded like someone still themselves. That is the word she chose in 1906, 33 years after the fact. Still themselves. Now I want to tell you about Cora's life, because Cora's life after 1872 is the third story in this case and the one that closes it. And it runs for 61 years. And it is not a sad story in the way you might expect. It is something else. It is the story of a woman who carries a very particular weight for a very long time and manages it with a precision and an economy that I have come to think of as remarkable in the way that the best responses to impossible things are always remarkable in their specificity and their restraint. She went back to school in January of 1873. She was, by the accounts of the schoolteacher and two other children who were later interviewed by Moseley, exactly the same child she had been before, except quieter in a way that was not sadness, but more like the quiet of someone who has been in a room where the furniture is different and has rearranged themselves accordingly. She did her work. She was good at mathematics, always had been. She sat at the edge of rooms the way her sister had sat at the edge of rooms, and the teacher who Moseley spoke to in 1906, a woman named Lula Fitch who had taught in the Hollow for 40 years, said that Cora had, after January of 1873, a quality that she struggled to name and then named as she always knew where the door was. In any room, at any time, Cora Vess always oriented herself to the door, not watching it fearfully, not nervously, just with a baseline awareness, the way a good sailor is always aware of the wind direction without making it obvious. She knew where the door was. She always faced it, slightly. She never had her back to it. She married at 22, a man named Presley Dunmore, a farmer from the Alderman's Mill area, good and steady, and the kind of man who did not demand explanations for the things his wife would and would not do. He learned about the name rule quickly and quietly, and he kept it for 52 years of marriage without ever asking her to explain it in full. His grandchildren, in interviews with the Historical Society in the 1960s, said that Grandfather Presley had a rule too, that he had adopted it at some point in the first year of the marriage and kept it ever after. And the rule was, you say Ellen once in this house, or you do not say it at all. He loved her. That is the simplest way to say it. He loved her, and he saw what she carried, and he organized his life around making it easier to carry, and he never once made her explain the weight to him, and she kept it for 61 years without ever setting it down. She had 5 children. She raised them in the house at Alderman's Mill. She taught them all to count and to say the multiplication tables, which they all assumed was an ordinary educational preference and which none of them ever connected to anything else. She kept the composition book in the cedar chest. She never spoke of the cut or of the 9 days or of her sister. When the county man came in 1915 asking about local folklore and strange events, she gave him coffee and told him nothing. When the preacher who sat with her in the last weeks gently asked about the name rule, she looked at him with the patience that people had been describing for 60 years and said, "The reasons are mine." She died in November of 1933. The month of November, 61 years after. The day of her death was the 12th, which Hattie noticed and wrote down in the family record without comment. The 12th of November, the same day she had come out. Hattie Dunmore said that her mother had been clear until the last hours, and that the last thing she said, in the afternoon before the evening she died, was addressed to the window, not to the people in the room. To the window, which faced west, toward the ridge. She said it in a normal speaking voice, not a whisper. And Hattie and her brother were both in the room, and both heard it. She said, "I am going to say it now. It has been long enough." And then she said a name. She said it twice. Hattie wrote. She said the name twice, which she had never done in 61 years of life in our hearing. And then she closed her eyes, and the look on her face was the look of a person who has put something down that was very heavy, and she did not say anything else. She died in the evening. The name, she said, was Ellen. I have been thinking about that for a long time, about what it means to say a name twice at the end of 61 years of saying it once, about whether she was saying goodbye or calling across or simply using, in the last hours of her life, The voice and the name she had been holding back for 6 decades, about whether she thought it would be heard, about whether she wanted it to be heard, about what a 61-year-old version of Ellen Vess, if she was still in any meaningful sense present in a limestone passage on Sorrow Ridge, would make of a name, said twice, in a voice she had known since they were children. I do not know the answer to any of those questions. I do not think answers are available, which is not the same as saying there are none. What I know is this. Cora Vess went into a thin place at 11 years old, and she negotiated with something very old and very patient and very hungry for what she had. And she came out alive, and she kept the rule for 61 years, and at the end, she set the rule down. And whether she set it down because she believed it no longer mattered, or because she believed it mattered more than anything, and she was no longer afraid of that, or because she had decided that 61 years of protection was enough, and now she wanted to give the thing it had always wanted and see what happened, I cannot tell you. The face that Hattie saw, the look of a person putting down something very heavy, could fit any of those 3, or all of them. Now I want to tell you about the visitors. Before we get to the end of this case and the present-day status of Widow's Cut and the thing I found in the county record when I was looking for something else, there is one more body of material I want to lay before you. It is not one of the 5 I mentioned at the start. It is a 6th thing that I did not know existed until late in the research, and it is the thing that changed the shape of the case for me more than anything in the composition book. In 1926, a man named Carroll Oakes was a surveyor working for a timber company that had purchased rights to the Sorrow Ridge area. He was from Roanoke. He had no prior knowledge of the history of the hollow or the cut. He went up to map the ridge in late October of that year with a colleague named Prentice Hadley, and on the 3rd day of the survey, they came to Widow's Cut. They went in. We know this because Carroll Oakes wrote about it. Not in a survey report. The survey report is routine, topographic, professional. He wrote about it in a letter to his wife that is in family possession, and the family gave me a typed transcription, and I have read the transcription several times. He writes, "We came through a cut in the ridge on Thursday. I don't know what to make of what happened in there, and I am writing it down so that I don't revise it in memory." The passage is about 30 yards long. Prentice went through ahead of me. I was at the south end, marking a measurement, when I heard Prentice call back to me from inside. He said my name. "Oakes, come look at this." And I said, "Just a minute." He writes, I finished the measurement and walked in. Prentice was at the middle of the passage, looking at the east wall. There were names cut into the stone, quite a few of them, in a column, and some of the cutting was very old, and some of it was newer. Prentice was reading them. I came up beside him and looked. I saw the names. I did not know any of them. Then Prentice said, quietly, mostly to himself, "Oakes, look at this last one." And I looked where he was pointing. The last name on the column, at the bottom, below all the others, freshly cut, was Prentice Hadley. He writes, I looked at it and I said, "How did that get there?" And Prentice said, "I don't know. I just found it." He said it had not been there the last time he came through, which was the previous spring, and he had noticed the column on that visit and read the whole thing, and this name had not been at the bottom. He writes, "We came out of there quickly. I did not hear anything unusual while we were in the passage. But I have been thinking about something since we came out, and I want to write it down while I still think it matters." When Prentice called back to me from inside the passage, he said my name. He called Oakes, just the once, from inside the passage. And then I called back to him from the south end. I said, "Just a minute," 2 words. And the second word contains my name. He writes, "Just a minute, Oakes, minutes, Oakes." He writes, my name was said twice in that passage, once by Prentice and once by me. I do not know if that matters. I am writing it down in case it matters. His colleague Prentice Hadley resigned from the survey company the following January without explanation. Carroll Oakes stayed with the company for another 12 years. He does not mention the cut again in any letter that the family has, but the family told me that in the last years of his life, in the 1950s, he had a habit that his children and grandchildren noticed and could not explain. When someone said his name, just his name, Carroll, in a normal way, in the house, calling him to dinner, or asking him something, he would pause before answering. A full pause, not long, half a second, with the quality of decision in it, and then he would answer. He taught his children not to say a name more than once in a row. He said it was bad manners. He said it came across as demanding. His children thought it was an old-fashioned propriety, a Southern formality about address, and they taught it to their children, and it is in that family now as an etiquette rule with no memory of where it came from. He invented the cover story himself, probably without knowing he was doing it, and he passed it on, and the original reason is gone, and only the rule is left. That is how it works, I think. That is how something like this survives. Not in horror stories, not in county histories, not in newspaper accounts. In rules that people keep without explanation, in habits that get passed from parent to child as politeness or superstition or family custom, in the refusal to say a name twice that gets translated into bad manners by someone who needed a reason to give their children and could not give them the real one. Cora Vess kept the rule for 61 years. She gave it to her children as a rule without explanation. Her daughter Hattie kept it without knowing why, as a habit absorbed from her mother the way you absorb your mother's habits. Hattie's children kept parts of it without knowing they were keeping anything. And somewhere, in the family branches from the hollow, there are probably people alive right now who do not say a name twice in the same breath, who could not tell you why, who would tell you if you asked that it is just how they were raised, that it is just a thing their family does. There is a version of this I find comforting, and a version I find terrible, and I am not sure they are different versions. The comforting version is that Cora's rule survived her, that she managed to pass on the protective structure without the trauma, that the thing in Widow's cut is still constrained in some way by the rule being kept out here in the world. The terrible version is that the rule is all that is left, that the understanding is gone and only the form is left, that somewhere out there a person who has never heard of Widow's cut is not saying a name twice because a great-grandmother in 1872 came out of a limestone passage and did not explain herself. I said at the beginning that Cora Vess did not tell. She wrote. She put it in the composition book and locked the composition book in a cedar chest. She chose the vessel of writing over the vessel of speaking, because a voice in the air can be heard, and a voice on paper can only be read. I am telling you this tonight, which is putting it into the air, in the voice of a storyteller, and it will go where voices go. I want to be honest about that. I want you to know I have thought about it. I have thought about what Cora would make of tonight, of a voice speaking all of this into a microphone and sending it through cables and waves and screens into whatever room or ear or dark you are in right now. I think she would find it imprecise. I think she would want me to be careful about names. I have been careful about names. I said Ellen's name tonight. More than once. I said it in the parts where it needed to be said. I said it always once at a time, with space around it. I did not say it twice in the same breath. That is not an accident. Now, there is one more thing. I told you there was something in the county record that I found when I was looking for something else, and this is the last piece of the material, and it is the shortest piece, and I have saved it for last, because it is the thing I have been least sure about how to tell you. In the Caldwell County deed records, held in the county clerk's office in Harrowfield, there is an entry from August of 1907, a deed transfer The property on the east face of Sorrow Ridge, on the Falling Branch drainage, changed hands in August of 1907. A timber company acquired it, same as the rest of the ridge. Eventually, routine. But there is a note on the deed, written in a different hand from the rest of the document, a note that the clerk apparently attached at the time of transfer. It says, "Property includes passage through ridge at Widow's Cut. Buyer advised that passage has been blocked since approximately 1973. Stone Fall. Passage now impassable. 1973. The year after the events of this case, the passage was blocked. A stone fall, the deed says. It does not say who caused the stone fall, or whether it was natural, or whether any investigating was done. It says impassable. Here is what I cannot account for, and what I want to put in front of you plainly, because it is the only intellectually honest thing to do. A stone fall that blocks a passage does not happen without sound. A stone fall of the magnitude required to close a 30-yard limestone cut to the point of impassability is an event. People in the hollow would have heard it, or found the evidence of it, and the silence in the county record about it, the absence of any account, any incident report, any note in the church minutes, anything, is the kind of silence that means either nothing happened that anyone wanted to write down, or that the something that happened was not a stone fall. Mosley went to the cut in 1906. He does not describe it as impassable. He describes it clearly enough that we understand he walked the full length of it, because he gives us the descriptions of the walls from the men who went in with the recovery party, passable in 1906. Impassable sometime before 1907, according to the deed. Between October of 1906 and August of 1907, Widow's Cut became impassable. Mosley interviewed Nettie Furl in October of 1906. 9 pages. The last thing in the Mosley transcript is a line that I want to read to you exactly as it appears in the transcription I was given, because I want you to have the words in their original order, and I want you to sit with them in that order. Mosley wrote, "She thanked me for coming. She said she was glad someone had come to write it down. She said she had been thinking for 34 years about what to do about the cut, meaning the names on the wall and the thing behind the wall, and that she had not found an answer that satisfied her. She said she thought the answer was probably going to have to be a permanent one, and that permanent answers required a willingness to break something that could not be fixed afterward, and that she was old enough not to be afraid of that, but not so old that she could not still do the necessary work. She said, 'Come back in a year and let me know if the passage is still open.' He apparently did not come back. He went to 2 other counties that winter and spring, working on the history that was never published, and if he returned to Caldwell County, there is no record of it. Nettie Furl died in the spring of 1907. She was 93 years old. The deed note says the passage became impassable approximately 1973. The deed was written in 1907. The note says approximately, which is the word a clerk uses when he is working from someone's word rather than from a date. I think Nettie Furl sealed the cut. I think she went up in the winter of 1906 or the spring of 1907 at 92 or 93 years old, and she did the thing she had been thinking about for 34 years, and she did it in a way that made the passage impassable, and whatever she did broke something that could not be fixed afterward, and she did it knowing that, and she died that spring. I do not know if it worked. I do not know if sealing the passage did anything to what was in it. I do not know if the names on the wall are still there, under the rubble. I do not know what a stone fall does to a thing that lives in limestone and has been there since before the ridge had a name. I know the passage has not been reopened, as far as I can find. I know Widow's Cut does not appear on current trail maps or in any recreational guide to the area. I know the ridge is logged over and second growth, and nobody farms the hollow anymore. I know the spring on Sorrow Creek, where the Vess family farm stood, is now grown over. I know that Ellen Vess went into Widow's Cut on the 2nd of November, 1872, and did not come out. I know that Cora Vess went in 3 days later and came out 9 days after that with a rule she kept for 61 years. I know that Nettie Furl heard a girl's voice inside the passage in April of 1873 saying the multiplication tables, and I know that the passage is now sealed. Whether the girl's voice is still in there, on the other side of the rubble, counting, staying herself, waiting for a name, said twice, "I cannot tell you. I can only tell you what the record says." The record says she went further in. I want to go back to Cora now, because I have not been fair to the shape of her life. I have given you the tragedy of it, the 9 days, the rule, the composition book, the grief she locked in a cedar chest, and I have not given you the life that surrounded all of that, and the life is worth giving you, because it is the answer to the question that the tragedy invites you to ask, which is, what does a person do with something like this? What do you do when you have been somewhere that the ordinary world does not have a category for, and you have carried something back from it that you cannot put down and cannot explain and cannot share? What Cora Vess did was live. That sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the most complicated kind of living, the kind that has to be built around a thing you cannot remove from the center of it, the way a house can be built around a tree if the tree was there first, and the people who come to live in the house love it enough to build the walls around it rather than cut it down. She taught her children mathematics. All 5 of them, young, earlier than the school in Alderman's Mill expected. She was patient and systematic about it, in a way that the oldest, a son named Harlan for his grandfather, described in a letter written in 1959 as almost ceremonial, not grim, not anxious, just exact. She said the numbers mattered, and she meant it in a way that did not seem to need explaining, and it did not occur to Harlan until he was in his 60s that there might have been a reason she felt that way about them that was not purely educational. She kept a kitchen garden with a precision that her neighbors found impressive and occasionally exhausting, not because she needed the production, though she used all of it, because she found, I think, that the specific and the countable and the grounded were the categories that kept her most entirely herself. And a kitchen garden run with care is one of the most specific and grounded things a person in a rural county can occupy themselves with. The number of feet between the rows, the days to maturity of each variety, the specific color of a ripe thing versus an almost ripe thing, details that have no interpretation and require no philosophy and cannot be used by anything that works on the general and the abstract. She was a good neighbor. This is mentioned by everyone who knew her, mentioned in the same matter-of-fact way that suggests it was so obvious it barely required saying. She was the one people called when something went wrong, not because she was the nearest or the most capable, though she was often both, but because she arrived and oriented to the problem with a speed and a directness that left no room for the wobbling that a crisis invites. She was the one who was already doing the thing, while other people were still asking what to do. Hattie said once that her mother had the quality of never being lost, and she meant it literally and also, I think, in a slightly different way, because a woman who learned in a limestone passage at 11 years old that the way to stay yourself is to know exactly where you are would probably carry that skill into every room she ever entered afterward. She sat at the edges of rooms. She always knew where the door was. She always faced it, slightly. She was precise about names. In the 1906 Moseley notebooks, there is a brief passage that I did not include earlier and want to include now. Moseley spoke to a woman who had been Cora's neighbor for 17 years, a woman named Bessie Stanhope, and Bessie told him a small thing that I have been carrying since I read it. She said, "Cora has a way when you say her name. When you say Cora, she comes to full attention in a way that most people do not not startled, not jumpy, attentive, like she has been waiting for exactly that word and is glad it has arrived. She does the same thing when you say any name around her. She gives names a particular respect, I suppose, is the word, like they are things that need to be handled carefully. She gives names a particular respect. An 11-year-old girl went into a thin place and negotiated with something old and hungry, and she came out with one rule, and she kept it for 61 years. And the quality it gave to the way she heard and said names was something her neighbor of 17 years noticed and described in 1906 as respect. Not fear, not caution, respect. I think Cora Vess understood names better than anyone else in this account. She had been inside the machinery of what a name is, the physical sound of it moving through air, the practice of it, the way it can be learned and reproduced and used for purposes the original speaker did not intend. She had given her own name to something that immediately made it into a tool. She had heard her own name come back out of stone in her own voice. She understood, from the inside, what a name does when it moves through the world, and she handled names accordingly. And the way she handled them looked, from the outside, like an unusual courtesy. I find that the most human thing in this entire case. That what a child learned from 9 days inside a thing that hunted names was to treat names with a particular and specific respect. That the lesson of the worst experience of her life was not to be afraid of names, but to be careful with them, the way you are careful with a tool that has an edge. Now, I want to tell you the one conversation in 61 years where Cora is on record as having come close to talking about the cut with another adult, and I say close because she did not actually tell it, but what she did instead is worth knowing. In 1915, the county man came. His name was Aldous Prigg, and he was employed by the state to document folklore and local custom in the rural counties. And he was thorough and well-intentioned, and he got nothing from Cora, as I mentioned. But there is a note in his file, in his own hand, that describes one exchange, and the exchange is brief and the note is short, but I want you to have it. He writes, "Called on Mrs. Dunmore, formerly Vess, in the afternoon. She was pleasant and gave coffee. Declined to discuss the events of 1872, and stated that the reasons were hers. I made one further attempt, asking simply whether she thought there was anything the county ought to know about the cut, for safety reasons, whether there was anything useful she could pass on. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 'The useful thing is the rule,' she said. 'The rule is that you say a name once. You say it clearly, and you say it once, and you mean it, and then you stop.' She said, 'If you are someplace where a name might be heard by something other than the person you are addressing, that is the only protection that I know of that you can be sure of.' She said, 'You do not need to know where such places are to keep the rule, because the rule is good manners in any place, and if you are someplace it particularly applies to, you will already be keeping it.' He writes, 'I am not sure I found this useful in a documentary sense, but I found it unexpectedly affecting. She spoke as though she was giving me instructions that I might personally need. You say a name once, you say it clearly, and you say it once, and you mean it, and then you stop.' That is 61 years of the composition book distilled into 2 sentences. That is the rule without the reason, because the rule without the reason is the thing she could give without risk. She kept the reason, she gave the rule, and she told it to a county man in 1915 in a way that was not a warning and not a confession and not a story, just a piece of practical information delivered in the voice of a person who is giving you something she thinks you might need without asking you to believe the reason for it. You say a name once, clearly, once. You mean it. Then you stop. I want to tell you the last thing I found in the research, and then I want to let you go, because it is late wherever you are, and you have been in this with me for a long time, And you deserve to know what I found at the end of it before you turn the lights back on. It is in the composition book, not in the 11 pages of writing, in the blank pages at the back, the 5 pages Cora left empty. Hattie Dunmore, when she gave the composition book to the Historical Society in 1958, mentioned that the last pages were blank and that she assumed her mother had stopped writing. The Historical Society cataloged the book that way, 11 pages of text, 5 blank. But blank pages in a pencil-written composition book are not always blank in the way that plain white paper is blank. They are blank to the eye. They are not necessarily blank to the touch, because a pencil that has been pressed hard into the page above will leave impressions in the pages below, faint but present, readable, if you hold the page at the right angle to the light, or rub it with the side of a soft pencil. The Historical Society, in 1994, undertook a conservation project on a number of their older paper holdings, and the composition book was in the collection, and a conservator ran a series of oblique light photographs on all 16 leaves, including the 5 blank ones. On the 5th blank page, the last page, the leaf at the very back of the book, there are impressions, not writing, not words, impressions of numbers, columns of them, as though someone had pressed a piece of paper flat against this page and written on it, and the page beneath had taken the impression. The conservator's note says, "Impressions consistent with numerical columns appear to show multiplication tables. Source page not present. These are secondary impressions only, from an unknown original." The original page, the page that was pressed against the last blank leaf and whose pencil impressions are visible in the oblique light, is not in the composition book. It was never in the composition book or was removed. It was a separate piece of paper held against the back of the book while someone wrote on it, and the impression it left is all that remains. The impression shows the multiplication tables, written in columns, with the particular attention to evenness and precision that a person brings to a thing they have been doing for a very long time. The Historical Society's conservation note is dated March of 1994. Below the conservator's description, a second person has written, in different handwriting, a question. The question says, "Is this Cora's hand?" And below the question, in the conservator's hand, is the answer, "Cannot determine, from impression alone, too faint to compare style characteristics. Cannot say, I cannot tell you whose hand it was. I cannot tell you when the impression was made, or by whom, or whether it was there when Hattie put the book in the cedar chest in 1933, or whether it arrived there some other way that I cannot account for. I cannot tell you what it means. I can tell you that the multiplication tables are the thing Cora said she used to stay herself, that she taught them to her children earlier than the school expected, that she said them under her breath in the dark of a limestone passage to keep the edges of herself from being worked on by something very patient and very old. And I can tell you that the impression on the last blank page of her composition book looks, in the oblique light photographs, like the work of a person who has been doing this for a very long time. Not for 9 days, much longer than 9 days. Steady and even and unhurried, the way a person works who is not doing this to finish, but to keep going. The way a person counts when there is no one coming, and they know there is no one coming, and they count anyway, because counting is the rope back to yourself, and the rope is the only thing you have, and you hold it. Now I want to do something I have been building toward for a while, which is to bring the other threads together and show you the full shape of what Widow's Cut appears to be, not as a local horror story or a county mystery, but as a kind of phenomenon with a logic to it, a logic that Cora and Thomas Crane and Nettie Furl each understood from a different angle, and that becomes clearest when you put all 3 angles together. Thomas Crane understood it from the outside. He sat at the entrance and listened without going in, and what he deduced was mechanical and precise, the thing in the wall practices names. The first time a name is said, it hears the name. The second time, it learns the voice. These are two separate events with two separate consequences, and the rule follows directly from them. You say the name once, you have given the thing a name but not a voice, and a name without a voice is harder to use. You say the name twice, you have given the thing a name and a voice in the same transaction, and a name with a voice is a working tool. Nettie Furl understood it cosmologically. She had the inherited knowledge of a community that had lived near this kind of thinness for generations, and her understanding was less mechanical and more about the nature of the ground itself. Some ground is thick, some ground is thin. Thin ground is the ground between here and whatever is on the other side of here, and the thing on the other side is not good or evil, but hungry. And what it is hungry for is what passes through the thin places, which is voices and names, and the particular human sound of a person making themselves known to another person. She understood it as a property of place rather than a property of a creature, which is why her response was eventually to seal the place rather than to confront the creature. Cora understood it from the inside. She understood it as a negotiation, as an economy, as a system with rules that could be worked with if you understood them well enough. She understood that the thing's hunger was also its constraint, that it needed what it could only get voluntarily, which was a voice willing to speak, and that a voice that was aware of the negotiation was a voice that could use the negotiation. She understood that the way to survive inside the thing's hunger was to be the most useful thing available, which was a living voice with more names to give, and to stay useful without giving away the particular names and voices that would enable the thing to operate outside the passage. She kept herself. She kept the multiplication tables. She kept the specific and the grounded. And she came out. And then she carried a simplified version of the knowledge back into the world in the form of a rule, and she passed the rule on, and Carol Oakes in 1926 absorbed some version of the rule without being taught it directly, just from going through the passage and understanding afterward what had happened, and he passed it on to his children as etiquette. And Nettie Furl, at 92 or 93, went up to the cut in the winter of 1906 or spring of 1907 and did what she had been thinking about for 34 years, and the cut became impassable, and no more names were added to the column on the wall, or at least no new witnesses have reported any. These are the three responses. Thomas Crane's response is observation without engagement. Nettie Furl's response is closure. Cora Vess's response is rule-keeping. All three are attempts to manage the same thing from three different positions, and all three are reasonable given the position, and all three left something unresolved because the thing they were responding to had been in the limestone for longer than any of them could account for, and limestone does not stop being limestone when you push rocks in front of it. I do not know what the current state of Widow's Cut is. I do not know if it is still sealed or if the stone fall has been cleared or shifted in a century of weather. I do not know if there is still something in the wall. I do not know if the column of names is still on the east face, under the rubble, or in whatever light gets into a sealed passage, still there in the stone, because stone does not erase. I know that Ellen Vess went further in. I know that Nettie Furl heard a voice in April of 1873 saying the multiplication tables. I know that Cora Vess put her hand to the back of a composition book and wrote something on a page held against it, sometime in the 61 years between 1872 and 1933, and that the impression of that writing is still visible in the oblique light, if you know to look for it. The impression shows the multiplication tables, written in the even, steady, unhurried hand of a person who has been doing this a long time. I want to be honest about this. I have spent considerable time trying to determine whether the impression on the last page of the composition book is consistent with the rest of Cora's hand in the book, and the conservator is right that you cannot determine this from an impression. You cannot compare the style of a faint, ghosted impression with the clear pencil writing in the main body of the text. The medium is too different. The conservator is right to say cannot say, but here is what you can say, and what I am going to say, and what I am going to let sit with you for as long as tonight sits with you. The impression is not in Cora's composition book. It was made by a page pressed against the composition book, a separate page, now gone, held against the back of the book while someone wrote on it. Someone who, at some point in the life of the composition book, held it close while they wrote the multiplication tables on a separate piece of paper, as though they wanted the counting to be in proximity to the record, as though the counting and the record were part of the same project, as though, and I am speculating now and I am saying so, as though the counting and the record were being kept by the same person in the same effort for the same reason, which is to stay. You say a name once. Clearly, once. You mean it. Then you stop. Cora Vess said it once. At the end, in the fall of 1933, after 61 years of once, she said it twice. She said it to the window, facing west, facing the ridge, in the voice she had always used for her sister, the voice that is a little different from the ordinary voice, the gentler one, the one she had described in the composition book at 11 years old. She said it twice. The look on her face was the look of putting something down. What she put down was not the grief. The grief she had been carrying for 61 years was not a weight she had been looking to set aside. What she put down was the restraint, the 61-year practice of saying it once and stopping. She set that down at the end and said it twice. And I believe she did it because she had decided that, whatever the consequences of saying it twice were, she was past the age of being afraid of consequences, and whatever it might bring, she wanted to give her sister that much. Her voice, saying that name, twice, aimed at the ridge. However far sound travels, however far a voice goes when it leaves a body. The name is a rope, Nettie Furl told Mosley. You say your own name in a room you know, in your own voice, and it is the surest rope back to yourself. Cora Vess, at 82 years old, dying, said her sister's name twice into the direction of the ridge, in the voice she had always reserved for her sister, in the voice she had given to the passage 61 years before, and kept for 61 years after. She threw a rope. Whether it reached anything, I cannot tell you. Whether the thing in the wall was still there to hear it, after a sealed passage and a century, I cannot tell you. Whether Ellen Vess, in whatever form Ellen Vess exists 61 years further in from where she went, heard her name in her sister's voice and did anything at all with it, I cannot tell you. I can tell you that Cora's face, at the moment of putting down the restraint, was the face of a person who had done the necessary thing. Not a face of grief, though grief was in it. Not a face of fear, though she had lived with fear's possibility for 6 decades. A face of the particular and specific relief of a person who has been doing something difficult and precise for a very long time and has at last been able to stop doing it. A face like the face of someone who has carried a weight so long she has forgotten what it is like to walk without it, and then sets it down and feels the difference in her shoulders and knows that whatever happens next, she is done with the carrying. She died that evening, November the 12th, the same date she had walked out of the cut 6 decades before, the same month she had gone in. I do not know if that is a coincidence. In 61 years of keeping things with the care and precision she brought to everything, I do not think Cora Vess left much to coincidence. I think she chose her date the way she had chosen everything else since she was 11 years old, deliberately and with the full weight of what she understood behind the choice. She chose November. She chose the 12th. She said the name twice, and she closed her eyes, and she put the weight down. And somewhere on Sorrow Ridge, in a sealed cut in the limestone, whether anyone is still counting or whether the counting is done, the walls that have been holding that weight for longer than any record shows are still holding it. Stone does not forget. Stone does not let go. Stone keeps what it has been given, in the cold and the dark, for as long as stone is stone. And in the spring of 1873, on an April morning, there was a girl's voice in the passage saying, "The multiplication tables. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. In and out, steady and even and unhurried, in the way of a person with nowhere else to be, and all the time in the world, and one rope back to herself, saying the numbers in the dark, in the way of a person keeping herself. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 5 is 10. I am still here. Let me step back from the ridge for a moment and tell you about the world that held all of this, because a story like this can make the setting feel like pure atmosphere, pure backdrop, pure dark woods and limestone and cold, and the truth is that the world of 1872 Caldwell County was also, simultaneously, a world with a daily texture and a social fabric, and the kind of community that has since been almost entirely disassembled, and the tragedy of what happened to the Vess family was made larger by the community that surrounded it, and made smaller by that community at the same time, which is how these things always work. The Sorrow Creek Hollow had been settled since the early part of the century. By the fall of 1872, there were 14 families in the hollow and adjacent drainages, all of them connected by kinship, commerce, and the kind of mutual dependency that comes from living in a place where the road goes impassable 4 months of the year, and your nearest neighbor is your first and most reliable resource. They helped each other birth children and bury them. They shared tools and labor and food in the bad years and labor in the good ones. They knew each other's business not from nosiness, but from proximity, from the simple fact that in a community that size, the business of any one family is immediately the business of all the others. This is why the search for Ellen Vess mobilized 40 men. 40 men from a hollow with 14 families is nearly every able-bodied adult male, plus men brought from adjacent hollows and the creek communities below. They went because Ellen was known to them, because the Vess family was known to them, and because in a place like that a missing child is a missing child from the whole community, not just the family. This is also why Cora's return was so carefully watched and so carefully not talked about. The people of that hollow understood, without anyone having to say it clearly, that something had happened that the ordinary categories did not cover, and they did what communities do when the ordinary categories fail, which is to close ranks and manage the information and keep the family together and say as little as possible to anyone from outside who might try to make something of it. The coroner's inquiry was not an investigation in any aggressive sense. It was a community performing due diligence on a tragedy. Alton Shade ran it, and Alton Shade was of the hollow and the community, and the inquiry concluded quickly with a finding that helped no one solve anything and harmed no one, which is the best that could have been expected from a formal process applied to an informal truth. The church closed ranks too. The minister at Sorrow Creek Baptist in 1872 was a man named Calhoun, who is not otherwise mentioned in any of the sources, and the 3 entries in the church minutes that bear on this case are all terse and careful and say exactly as little as a church minute can say while still recording that the meeting took place. The community knew, they all knew, in the way communities know things that nobody has said out loud, in the accumulated weight of what is not said and what is not asked, and who sits where on Sunday, and how loud a man speaks when he says Ellen Vess's name, and whether the Vess girl flinches when he does. Cora did not flinch. People would have watched for that. She did not give them anything to watch for, because by the time she was back in that community, she had already built the structure around herself. The counting, the specifics, the rule, the composition book in her pocket, the knowledge of where the door was, and she was inside that structure, the way a house is inside its walls, and the walls were not visible from the outside. And what people saw was a quiet child who had lost her sister and was bearing it in the way the community preferred their grief to be borne, which was privately and without drama, and with the full weight of it on the inside where it could not be seen. She was good at that. It was the same thing her mother was good at, and I think it was a shared inheritance, mother and daughter, the turning of grief inward, the maintenance of the surface. In Prudence Vess, it was a quality that had been noted as frightening. In Cora, it was noted as steady. Same quality, different decade, different name. What changed between Prudence and Cora is that Cora had a reason for hers. Prudence locked her grief in because the world did not offer her a good vessel for it, and she needed to function. Cora locked hers in because she understood that keeping the structure tight was the thing that kept the thing in the wall from using it. Her mother kept grief in because she had to. Cora kept grief in because she had reasoned that it was the right choice. There is a difference in those two reasons, and the difference is the thing I find most remarkable about Cora Vess. She was not suppressing emotion. She was using the management of emotion as a protection, which is a more sophisticated thing to do, and she understood that at 11 years old, in a limestone passage, working it out from scratch. The Vess family left the Hollow in the spring of 1874. Harlan sold the farm in March of that year to the family of one of the Meadows men who had been in the search party, and they moved to Alderman's Mill, where there was more commerce and more people and, presumably, more distance from the ridge. The apple orchard they left behind. Mosley writes that the orchard was still producing in 1906, still putting out the russets and the Vess yellows in their season, and that the man who owned it by then said he always felt a little uncomfortable in it, without knowing why, and that he had the feeling sometimes, working the trees in October, of someone just out of sight at the edge of the orchard, watching. Harlan Vess died in 1887. Prudence outlived him by 14 years, dying in 1901. June Vess, the younger brother, who was 7 in 1872, grew up and moved to Ohio, and is the last traceable member of the direct Vess family. He died in 1931, 2 years before Cora, and I do not know if he and Cora were in contact in the later years. I hope they were. I hope they had the kind of ordinary sibling relationship that involves letters about grandchildren and arguments about who gets the good chair at Christmas, and I hope that whatever the cut did to the family in 1872 did not prevent them from having that. There is a note in the county death records for Cora Vess Dunmore, filed in the winter of 1933. It is routine. Date of death, cause of death listed as age and heart failure, which is the way the rural South recorded the deaths of old people who simply ran out of time. Surviving family, husband Presley Dunmore, 5 children, 11 grandchildren. It is 3 sentences. There is nothing in the death record about a composition book. There is nothing about a rule. There is nothing about a limestone passage on Sorrow Ridge, or a name said twice at a window, or the feel of putting down a weight you have been carrying since you were 11 years old. There is not supposed to be. That is not what death records are for. Death records record the fact of a death and the survivors and the cause in the ordinary categories, and the truth of Cora Vess's life does not fit the ordinary categories, and so the death record is 3 sentences, and the composition book is in a cedar chest under a quilt, and the 5 blank pages at the back have an impression on the last one that a conservator in 1994 described as numerical columns consistent with the multiplication tables. And there it sits. There it has sat for a very long time. In the oblique light, if you hold it at the right angle, you can see the numbers, written by someone who was doing it to stay, written in the particular, even patient hand of a person keeping one rope and holding it. Now, I want to say a few things about the present, because this is a documentary and not a ghost story, and a documentary has an obligation to tell you the state of things as they stand, not just as they stood 150 years ago. The property that includes Widow's Cut has changed hands several times since 1907. The timber company that Carol Oakes worked for held it until the 1950s, logged it twice, and sold it to a private holding company that sold it in the 1980s to a family from out of state that used it as hunting land. That family sold in 2011. The current owners, as of my research, are an LLC whose principals I could not identify from public records, and the property is not listed for sale and does not appear to be actively used. No public trail runs through or near the cut. The hollow below it is accessible by a gravel road that was once County Route something and has been absorbed into the state forestry system and is gated. I found one mention of the cut in a regional hiking resource from the 1990s that described it as historically impassable due to a rockfall and noted that the approach trail was overgrown and the area was not recommended. I have not been there. I am saying that plainly because I think you should know it. Everything I have told you tonight is from documents and transcripts, and I have not stood at the south entrance of Widow's Cut, and I have not heard what Thomas Crane heard when he sat at the edge of it. I do not know what it sounds like now. I do not know if the voice in the passage is still there, or if 60 years of sealing and a century of silence has changed anything about the quality of the place. I know what Nettie Furl said about what she intended to do when she sealed it. She said she was going to do a permanent thing. She said permanent things break something that cannot be fixed afterward. I know she was 92 or 93, and she had been thinking about it for 34 years, and she knew the ground, the way a person who has lived their whole life in a hollow knows the ground, which is entirely and from the inside. I think she did the thing she intended to do. I think she did it well. I think Widow's Cut, sealed and silent and grown over, and not on any current map, is as close to contained as something like that can be contained. But I also think that limestone is limestone, and that what is in limestone does not care about human timelines, and that patient things have a relationship with time that is not our relationship with time, and that something that has been practicing names in a ridge cut since before any European foot touched that hollow is probably still practicing, in the dark, in the quiet, in the long patience of stone. I am going to leave it there. Not because I do not have more to say, but because some things are better left in the dark where they have been, and not brought any further out into the air than they need to be. You have the shape of it now. You have the composition book, and the letter, and the transcript, and the deed, and the conservator's note, and the face of a woman putting down a weight at the end of a long life. You have enough. You have enough to carry it with the right care. Now, I want to go back to the Dorothea Crane letter one more time because I said I would give you most of it, and I have only given you pieces. I have been careful about how much of it to share, because some of what Dorothea wrote in those 22 pages is the writing of a woman coming very close to the edge of what she can hold, and I do not want to sensationalize that. She was a real person in a real crisis, and she deserves to be read with care. But there is a passage in the middle of the letter, roughly around page 11, that I want to give you in full, because it is the place where Dorothea says something that none of the other sources say, something that changes the shape of the mythology in a way that I think is important, and that Cora Vess appears to have understood intuitively without having access to this letter. Dorothea writes, "To her sister, I have been trying to understand what it wants. Thomas says it wants names and voices, and I believe he is right about that, but I think there is something under that which he does not have the years to understand yet, which is why it wants names and voices. I have been listening to it through Thomas for 6 months now, listening to what he tells me about what he hears at the entrance, and I have come to a conclusion that I do not know how to tell Elbert because Elbert is not the kind of man who considers conclusions of this kind," she writes. "The thing in the cut has been there for a very long time, longer than Thomas or I or anyone I know of has been alive, and in all that time it has been collecting names. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, I do not know how many. Names with voices. Voices attached to specific people, specific lives. And I think the reason it wants these things is not simply appetite, not simply hunger in the way we use that word, meaning the hunger of a creature that wants to consume. I think it wants names and voices because it is trying to build something. She writes, I think it is trying to build a person. She writes, I think it has been trying for a very long time to assemble enough of the raw material of personhood, which is to say, names and voices, and the particular way a specific person says a specific thing, to make something that can leave the passage. Thomas told me it said, I do not go out. He told me it said this without being asked, as though it anticipated the question. And I have been thinking about that, and I think it said it not because it is trapped in the passage, but because it is not yet complete enough to go out. I do not go out means not yet. It is working toward the capacity to go out. She writes, the reason it wanted us to bring people through without warning them is not simply to add more names to its collection. It is because a person who comes through a thin place unknowing, speaking names into the stone without understanding what they are doing, gives the thing something qualitatively different from what it gets from a person who is guarded. An unknowing person is fully themselves when they come through. Everything about them is present and available. All the weight of their personhood, undefended, just moving through a passage and a ridge in the ordinary way. And what the thing gets from that, I think, is a complete and undivided version of a voice, rather than the careful, guarded fragments it gets from someone like Thomas, who sits at the edge and gives it nothing directly. She writes, I think each complete version it takes in brings it one step closer to having enough. I think it has been doing this for so long because personhood is very complex, and the material for it is very specific, and what it collects from one voice is not easily combined with what it collects from another, and the work of synthesis is very slow. She writes, I think what Cora's 9 days inside the passage would have looked like, from the thing's perspective, is 9 days of a fully present, fully guarded, highly specific person refusing to give it an unknowing gift. I did not know Cora Vess. I am writing this 3 years before her time in the passage. But I think that what she did, what someone like her would do in the passage, would be to give the thing an education in what a complete person looks like while guarded, while knowing, while refusing to be consumed. And I think that education might be the most valuable thing anyone ever gave it, and the most dangerous. She stops for a few lines, and then she writes, I am saying that the worst thing that could happen is for someone to go into the passage knowing what it is and to stay long enough for it to study them. Because the thing it is building is built from the knowledge of what a person is, and what a complete and specific person is when they are fully present and fully aware and holding themselves together in the dark. That is the most complete picture of personhood that exists. That is personhood at its most essential and most precise. 9 days of Cora Vess counting in the dark would teach it more about what a person is than years of unknowing visitors. And then she writes the sentence that I have been thinking about since I read it. The sentence that I believe is the most important sentence in any of the documents I have read for this case. She writes, I think the reason Cora Vess survived is not only that she was careful about names. I think the reason she survived is that she was more herself than the thing had ever encountered. And being that herself, that precisely, that stubbornly, with the multiplication tables and the specific small things and the back of her mother's hand, was somehow the one form of presence that the thing could not absorb, because you cannot absorb something that knows exactly what it is and refuses to be otherwise. She writes, I think the lesson is not the rule. The rule is the expression of the lesson. The lesson is, know exactly what you are, at all times, in as much detail as you can manage, and do not let the specific, and the named and the grounded parts of yourself be replaced by the general or the abstract or the lost. 2 times 2 is 4. I am Cora Vess. I am 11 years old. The russets go in the cold cellar. The back of my mother's hand is cool. My sister's name is... And there the Crane letter, on page 11, goes to a different subject, because Dorothea had children and a farm and a husband and a practical letter to write to a sister she loved, and she could not spend all 22 pages on this. She goes on to other things. She comes back to Thomas twice more, in a more oblique way, and then the letter stops in the middle of a sentence on page 22. But the question she left on page 11 is the question I want to leave with you. If the thing in Widow's Cut has been building something from names and voices for as long as it has been in the limestone, and if Cora Vess's 9 days in the passage were the most complete picture of a specific person that it had ever had the opportunity to study, and if what Nettie Furl did in the winter of 1906, or spring of 1907, was to seal the passage from the outside, if all of those things are true, then what Nettie Furl sealed inside is not only the thing, it is also the thing's most complete study, its best material, its nearest to complete version of what it is trying to build. And, inside the sealed passage, in the dark, whether the counting is still going or has long since stopped, whether Ellen Vess is still in there in any meaningful sense, or has long since gone somewhere beyond the reach of names, whether the thing is still practicing or has been stilled by the sealing, however stone changes things after a century, inside the sealed passage, there is everything that Nettie Furl could not take out when she closed the door. The names on the wall, the column, the oldest at the top and the newest at the bottom, Ellen's name in Ellen's hand, freshly cut, the stone dust still on the ground below it, and whatever it was that Cora gave to 9 days of being precisely and stubbornly herself in the dark, the thing that was built from the multiplication tables and the specific small thoughts and the back of a hand and a girl's name, said once and then not again. Whatever the thing in the wall made from all of that, whatever it has become, in 150 years of dark and quiet and no new voices, whatever is waiting, if the door were ever opened, to step out into the light on a limestone gravel creek bed and begin to find out what the world outside the passage is like, and say hello, perhaps, in a voice that is familiar, in a voice you recognize, in the voice of someone you once knew or heard about or read about in a composition book, with the multiplication tables ready and the specifics of a person intact, and the particular unhurried patience of something that has been counting in the dark for a very long time and is not in any hurry at all. I do not think the door will be opened. I think Nettie Furl did what she intended to do. I think she was 92 years old, and she had thought about it for 34 years, and she was not a person who left things incomplete. I think the door is closed and will stay closed. I think. And I think the rule is good to keep regardless. Not because Widow's Cut is a danger to you in your specific life, in your specific location, wherever you are watching this from tonight, but because Dorothea Crane was right that the rule is an expression of a lesson, and the lesson is worth keeping independent of the thing that teaches it. Know exactly what you are. Know the specific and the named and the grounded parts of yourself. Know the back of the hand and the multiplication tables and the number of feet between the rows and the color of a ripe thing. Know your own name and say it clearly and say it once and mean it. Know the names of the people you love and say them with the care that things that are precious deserve to be said with, which is to say, carefully and deliberately and once at a time, and with the full weight of who you are behind each one. Say a name once. Say it like it matters. Because it does matter, in this story and in every story, and what Cora Vess understood at 11 years old in a limestone passage on a Virginia ridge in November of 1872 is the thing I want you to carry out of tonight. A name is a rope. You say it in a room you know, in a voice you know is yours, and it is the surest way back to yourself that there is. You say the names, you stay yourself. You do not give anything else anything to work with. You say it once, clearly, once, and then you stop. There is one more thing I want to tell you about, and then I will let you go. It is a small thing, and I have been uncertain about whether to include it at all, because it is the piece of material in this case that I am least able to account for and least comfortable presenting with any confidence. But I said at the beginning that when two sources disagree, I would lay both in front of you, and this is one of those disagreements, and it is worse than either version alone. You remember the two photographs of the blackboard in the sheriff's file? Wait, I have confused myself. That is from a different case. Let me be precise. In this case, the two sources that disagree are the Mosley transcript and the Crane letter, on a single point. Mosley writes, in his transcript of Nettie Furl's account, that the voice she heard in the passage in April of 1873 was saying the multiplication tables. He is very clear about this. She said, low voice, measured, like a person counting, it sounded like the multiplication tables. The Crane letter, which was written in spring of 1869, 3 years before Cora went into the passage, and which therefore cannot have been influenced by Cora's experience, contains the following sentence on page 14. In a section where Dorothea is describing something Thomas told her about what he heard at the entrance of the passage, she writes, Thomas came home on Thursday and said he had heard something new at the south entrance. He said he heard a voice inside, low and steady, not loud, saying numbers in a pattern. He said it sounded like the multiplication tables, but wrong. He said the answers were wrong. He said, it knows the numbers, but it does not know what order they go in. It is practicing, but it has not learned them yet. Spring of 1869. The thing in the wall was saying the multiplication tables, according to a 13-year-old boy who sat at the entrance and listened, but it had the answers wrong. It was practicing, but had not learned them yet. Cora Vess goes into the passage in November of 1872. She says the multiplication tables to stay herself for 9 days. She teaches them, inadvertently, through 9 days of saying them in a limestone passage, to something that had been trying to learn them for at least 3 years. Nettie Furl comes back in April of 1873, and hears a voice in the passage saying the multiplication tables. And the voice she hears, the voice she says sounds like a girl's, the voice she decides to leave alone because whoever is in there sounds still all right, still themselves. She hears that voice saying the multiplication tables. But in spring of 1869, the voice in the passage was saying the multiplication tables wrong. It did not know what order they went in. And in April of 1873, after 9 days of Cora Vess, the voice in the passage is saying the multiplication tables. Nettie Furl does not tell Mosley whether the voice was saying them correctly. She says low. She says measured. She says like a person counting. She says she listened for a moment and then left because whoever was in there sounded still all right. She does not say whether the answers were right. And I have been sitting with that omission for longer than I am comfortable admitting, because it is either an omission that does not matter, because, of course, Nettie Furl assumed the answers were right, because why would the answers not be right, and she did not think to note it, or it is an omission that matters enormously, because if Nettie Furl listened to the voice in April of 1873 and heard the multiplication tables and the answers were wrong, then the voice she heard was not Cora's voice and not Ellen's voice. It was the thing's voice. It was a thing that had been trying to learn the multiplication tables for years, that had finally gotten 9 days of the most complete and specific teaching it had ever received, and that was practicing in the dark of a sealed passage, not the way a person practices something they know and are holding on to, but the way a thing practices something it is still learning and does not yet have right. And Nettie Furl, at the south entrance, on an April morning, heard that and thought, still all right, still themselves, and left. I cannot resolve this. I cannot call Nettie Furl back from 1906 and ask her whether the answers were right. I cannot ask Thomas Crane, who died in 1897, what he heard in spring of 1869 that was almost the multiplication tables, but wrong. I cannot go to Widow's Cut and listen at the entrance and check for myself, and even if I could, I would not know whether what I heard was the correct or the incorrect version, because I would not have Thomas Crane's 13 years of listening at the entrance to calibrate the difference. I cannot resolve it. What I can do is leave it with you. You have spent 3 hours with this case. You have the composition book and the Crane letter and Nettie Furl and the deed, and Carol Oakes and 61 years of Cora Vess, keeping the rule and a conservator's note about an impression on the last blank page. You have the shape of it. You know what Dorothea Crane thought the thing in the passage was building. You know what Thomas Crane heard in 1869. You know what Nettie Furl heard in 1873. You know that the difference between those two hearings, between almost right but wrong, and what Nettie Furl called still all right, is the difference between the thing and the person. And you know that Nettie Furl, who had lived on Sorrow Creek for 58 years and who had more knowledge of thin ground than anyone else in this account, heard the voice in April of 1873 and made a decision. She listened for a moment. She decided it was still all right. She left. I trust Nettie Furl. I think she knew what she was listening for, and I think she heard it. I think she heard a girl's voice saying, "The multiplication tables correctly, in the measured, even way of a person who is using the numbers to stay herself, and that is what she decided was still all right." I believe that. I also believe Thomas Crane heard the thing saying the multiplication table's wrong in 1869. And I believe the thing spent the intervening 3 years continuing to practice. And I believe Cora Vess gave it 9 days of the clearest possible instruction in how to say them correctly. And I am not certain that Nettie Furl, at the south entrance on an April morning, could have told the difference between a girl counting correctly and a thing that had finally, after years of practice, gotten the counting right. I am not saying she was wrong. I am saying that I cannot be certain she was right. And there is a difference between those two things that I will not collapse just because collapsing it would make the story more comfortable. You say a name once, clearly, once, and then you stop. And if you hear it come back to you from somewhere it should not come from, in a voice that is almost the right voice but has something of the door in it, if you hear it come back at all, you say your own name, once, in a room you know, in a voice you know is yours, and you count, and you stay. You stay exactly who you are, because that is the only rope there is. And because whatever is in the dark at the other end of the thin place is very patient and very practiced, and the only thing it cannot absorb is a person who knows exactly who she is and will not, under any circumstances, be otherwise. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. I am here. I am still here. I am counting. I know exactly what I am and what room I am in and whose voice this is. It is mine. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 5 is 10. I am not done yet. Now I want to come back to something I set aside earlier in the case, which is the question of what it is like to know something that no one else around you knows. Not in the sense of a secret, not in the sense of knowledge held back from specific people for specific reasons, but in the older and harder sense of knowing something that the ordinary world does not have a category for, and having to carry it in a world that is organized around the categories it does have and not the ones it does not. Cora Vess knew what she knew from November of 1872 until November of 1933. 61 years. She knew it the way you know the multiplication tables or the layout of your house in the dark, not as a learned thing anymore, but as a part of the furniture of the mind, always there, always available, always present underneath whatever else is being thought or done. She knew that there is something in a particular limestone passage in Caldwell County, Virginia, that has been collecting names and voices since before any record shows. She knew that her sister had gone into it and not come out. She knew that the thing in the passage worked on the edges of a person in the particular patient way that stone works on anything it has long enough to work on. She knew that the multiplication tables and the specific and the grounded were what kept a person themselves in the presence of something that wanted to unmake that specificity. She knew the rule, and she went to church on Sundays, and she helped her neighbors, and she raised 5 children, and she kept a kitchen garden, and she grew old with a man who loved her, and none of it required her to put the knowledge down. She carried it the way you carry anything you have had long enough to stop being aware of. The way a river carries silt, invisibly, continuously, as part of its nature, not as an addition to it. I think of the other people in this case who carried things. Prudence Vess, who locked her grief inward and had already buried 2 children before she lost Ellen. Harlan Vess, who sold the farm in the spring of '74 and moved his family away from the ridge without explaining why. Emmett. No, wrong case again, my apologies. Let me stay in the material. Nettie Furl, who watched from her fence at 1:45 in the morning and went back to bed and said her own name and her dead husband's name in the dark, and then went to sleep. Thomas Crane, who sat at the entrance and listened without going in, and came home and told his mother, and then one day stopped going, apparently, because Dorothea writes in the later pages that he has not been back up since January. Carol Oakes, who noticed in 1926 that his colleague's name had appeared on the wall, and who came home and wrote a letter to his wife about the structure of what had happened, about the mechanics of it, and then apparently put it away and went on with his life except for the pause before answering when someone said his name. All of them carrying something. All of them finding a way to organize a life around a weight that did not fit the ordinary categories. The interesting thing to me, looking at the whole of this case, is that the ones who carried it best were the ones who had the most specific and particular relationship with the knowledge. Nettie Furl had a cosmology for it. She knew the language of thin ground and what it meant, and she had names for the categories, even if the names were old ones that the county man might have found quaint. Thomas Crane had an empirical relationship with it. He understood it mechanically. He had deduced the rule from observation. He had a functional theory of how it worked. Cora had the most intimate knowledge of all. She had been inside it, and she had negotiated with it, and she had her own name come back to her in her own voice, and she had heard her sister through the wall, and she was the one who survived it most completely, which is to say, survived it in a way that let her build a full life afterward, rather than just a life arranged around a damage. The specificity was the protection. Not just in the passage, not just for those 9 days. The specificity was the protection for 61 years. You cannot be unmade by something if you know exactly what you are. And Cora Vess knew exactly what she was, at 11 years old, in a limestone cut. And she kept knowing it for 6 more decades. And the way she kept knowing it was to keep the things that told her, the multiplication tables, the kitchen garden, the back of a hand, the smell of a ripe russet, the number of feet between the rows. I think the composition book was also part of that. The practice of writing things down precisely in plain language with no decoration and no hedging is itself a form of knowing what you are, because it requires you to be honest with yourself about what actually happened and what you actually know and what you are only guessing. The composition book is not a scared child's account of a terrifying thing. It is an 11-year-old girl's careful and precise record of what she observed, what she deduced, what she decided, and why. It is the record of a mind that knows how to be a mind, and is using that knowledge actively in an unusual circumstance, the way you use a skill when the usual circumstances no longer apply. She was not a remarkable child in any external sense. She was good at mathematics. She was quick, in the sense her sister meant. She carried a composition book in her coat pocket because she liked to write things down. She was plain and steady and 11 years old, and she went into a limestone cut looking for her missing sister. And she found something she did not have a category for, and she did not panic, and she did not run, and she did not give it what it wanted, and she counted, and she came out, and she made a rule out of what she had learned, and she kept the rule, and she passed it on in a form that did not require the reason, and she lived a long and full life, and she died in the month she had always associated with her greatest test, and at the end she put the rule down and said the name twice, and whatever that meant to her, or to whatever she meant it for, she felt lighter afterward. She had been a girl in a passage in the dark. She had been a woman in a house in the light. She had been a mother and a neighbor and a keeper of a kitchen garden and a teacher of mathematics and a wife of a man who did not ask questions she did not want to answer, and who was better for not asking. She had been the keeper of a rule for 61 years, and at the end she had been someone who could put the rule down and say the name and mean it, which is perhaps the fullest thing any person ever gets to be, the version of themselves that is not afraid of the thing they have been protecting themselves from, because the protection has done its work and the work is done. Let me tell you the last small thing. Hattie Dunmore, giving the composition book to the Historical Society in 1958, was asked if she knew why her mother kept a composition book from her childhood for 60 years. She said she did not know. She said she had found it in the cedar chest with the family papers and had thought it was just the kind of thing a person keeps, a childhood artifact, and she had given it to the Historical Society because it seemed the right place for it, because her mother had clearly valued it enough to keep it. She was asked if she had read it. She said yes, she had read it before giving it in. She was asked what she had made of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think my mother was a very brave child." She said it in the tone of someone making a considered statement, not a sentimental one. Not, "I think my mother was wonderful," or, "I miss my mother." I think my mother was a very brave child, as though the bravery and the childness were the two salient facts that had come through the 11 pages, and the rest of it, the passage, the 9 days, the rule, the thing in the wall, was the context for those two facts, but not the point of them. She said, "She must have been very frightened, and she did not let it stop her from thinking, 'I would like to have been like that. I would like to have been like that.'" Hattie Dunmore, in 1958, had a daughter and a son and grandchildren, and a life in the same county her mother had lived in, and she was an ordinary woman, in the best sense of ordinary, and she read her mother's composition book, and what she took from it was not the horror and not the mythology and not the rule. She took the model of a child who was frightened and kept thinking anyway, and she thought she would have liked to have been like that, and she was honest about not knowing if she would have been. That is the best gift this case has given me. Not the mechanics of the thin place, or the rule about names, or the question of what Nettie Furl heard at the entrance in April of 1873. The best gift is Hattie Dunmore saying, "I would like to have been like that," and meaning it genuinely and without the certainty that she would have been, because that is the honest response to Cora Vess. Not admiration from a safe distance, not the comfortable certainty that you would have done the same. The honest response is, "I would like to have been like that. I do not know if I would have been." She was 11, and she was frightened, and she kept thinking. And that is the hardest thing and the most necessary thing, and the thing that most of us are least certain we would manage if it came to us. She counted. She said the names. She stayed herself. and she came out. So, you have been with me for a long time tonight, wherever you are, whatever room or dark or bed or corner of an ordinary house you have been listening from. You have spent 3 hours with a case that has no clean resolution, no simple lesson, no moment where the mystery is lifted and the light comes in and everything becomes clear. I promised you at the beginning that this would not be a shrug at the end, and I have kept that promise. But the answer I have given you is not the comfortable kind of answer, and I want to acknowledge that before we close. Cora Vess went into Widow's Cut, and she came out. Her sister did not. She kept a rule for 61 years that she never fully explained, and she put the rule down at the end, and she died. The passage was sealed by a 92-year-old woman who had been thinking about it for 34 years. The passage has been sealed for over a century. Nobody has heard anything from inside it. Nobody has added a name to the column on the east wall, as far as any record shows, since the fall of 1872. These are the facts that allow you to sleep. They are real facts, and I am not hiding anything behind them. The passage is sealed. The hollow is empty. The farm is grown over. The spring is grown over. The orchard probably still puts out the russets and the Vess yellows in their season because apple trees are stubborn things, but there is no one to harvest them, and no one to carry them down the hollow, and no one to put them in the cold cellar for the keeping. And somewhere in the sealed dark of a 30-yard limestone passage on the east face of Sorrow Ridge, whether the counting is still going or has long since stopped, the wall has what it has been given: the names, the voices, the column that went from old at the top to new at the bottom and stopped, the stone walls that moved like a chest breathing. In the fall of 1872, in the drought year, when the cracks had opened and things came out of the limestone that had been held in it, the thinking sound, low and sustained, that came through the stone on the 7th day of 9 days, and the impression of the multiplication tables on the last blank page of a composition book that sat in a cedar chest under 2 quilts and a pair of gloves for 25 years, and now sits in a climate-controlled archive in a county historical society, and the conservator's note that says, "Cannot determine from impression alone, too faint to compare, cannot say," and the question in the other handwriting that says, "Is this Cora's hand?" Cannot say. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 5 is 10. I am here. I am counting. Let me ask you one question before you go. And it is the same kind of question the case opened with, and it is the right kind of question to leave it on, because this story is built on questions that do not fully resolve, and I think the right way to close it is with one more. Have you ever said someone's name twice in a row? Not because you forgot you had already said it, not because you were calling for someone who did not hear you the first time, just because it felt right to say it twice, in the same breath, the way you say the name of someone you love when you are thinking about them and no one is around to hear, just the name twice, in your own voice, in an empty room, because the name feels good to say, and you wanted to say it twice. Have you ever done that? And have you ever, in the moment or after, had the strange, brief impression of being heard? Not by the person you were thinking of, not by anyone in the house, just the sense of the name having gone somewhere outside the room, having moved through the air and kept moving past the walls, the way sound carries further on a still night than you expect it to, the way your voice comes back to you changed after it has traveled through a hollow. Have you ever said a name twice and felt it land somewhere? I am not telling you that you should be afraid of that. I am not telling you that every thin place has a thing in it and that every doubled name is a gift to something that wants what you have. The world is full of names said twice, and the world mostly goes on. Most hollows are just hollows. Most limestone cuts and most ridges are just geology. But, Nettie Furrell said, In a place where a name might be heard by something other than the person you are addressing, the only protection that she knew of was to say the name once. And she knew her ground. She had lived on that ground for 58 years, and her grandmother before her, and the grandmother before that, and the inherited knowledge she carried was the accumulated practical wisdom of people who had been near thin ground their whole lives and had worked out, over generations, what to do about it. Say the name once, clearly, once, mean it, then stop. It is good advice for any place. It is something more than advice for a particular kind of place. You know now what that particular kind of place looks like. You know the tree line that is too clean, the silence with a presence in it rather than an absence, the sound of a list being read in the dark when you are certain no one is reading, the cold in a place where there is no draft to explain the cold, the light that behaves differently inside a passage than outside it, as though the air in there has a different relationship with what passes through it. You know the quality of the thing's patience, which is the patience of stone, which is not the patience of something waiting for you to hurry up. It is the patience of something that has already decided it can wait as long as it needs to. And you know, from core of S, what to do if you find yourself in it. You count. You say the specific things. You know the exact quality of the back of a hand. You stay yourself as precisely and as stubbornly as you can manage, because yourself is the only thing it cannot unmake if you will not let it. And the will comes from the precision, and the precision comes from the counting, and the counting comes from the knowledge that 2 times 2 is 4, and has always been 4, and will be 4, as long as you are you. And as long as you know that, you are still here. You are still here. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. Put it in the comments, the town, the county, the country, the room. I want to know how far a voice travels when it is sent out on a night like this one. And if this is the kind of case you would want more of, the old cases, the buried ones, the ones that the county records half say and the family papers say the rest of, the collection is called What the Hollow Keeps, and the link is in the description below, and it is 12 of these, end to end, in the voice you have been listening to tonight. If you have been in these hollows before, if you have a case of your own, if you know a piece of ground that has a name because something happened in it, and the name is the kind that gets given to a scar, put it in the comments. I want to hear it. I read everything. The next case finds you in the dark on a long night when you cannot sleep. And it will be another case like this one, slow and true and built from the ground up, from documents and transcripts and the plain words of ordinary people who encountered something that the ordinary categories did not cover and who managed it as best they could. Stay with the names. Say them carefully. Say them once. Give them the weight they deserve, the full weight of the person behind them. Say your own name last, out loud, in a room you know, in a voice you know is yours, before you go to sleep tonight. And sleep with the light that tells you exactly where you are. There is one last thing I want to say, and I am going to say it plainly, in the same voice I have used for the last 3 hours, without decoration. The composition book exists, the Mosley transcripts exist, the county records exist, the Crane letter exists, the deed note exists, the conservator's report exists. I have given you references to all of them, and you can pursue them if you want to, and I encourage you to, because the documents are their own experience and reading them is different from hearing me tell you about them. There is something about reading Cora's own handwriting, or rather, reading a description of her handwriting, from people who held the book and noticed the places where the pencil went harder into the page, that the telling cannot replicate. There is something about the 11 pages of a child writing in plain sentences about the most important and most unreachable experience of her life that does not compress into narration without losing something. If any of this case has taken root in you tonight, the documents are where to go next, And if you find yourself, some time from now, in a place that has a quality you recognize from tonight, the presence of listening, the silence with an edge on it, the tree line too clean, you know what to do. You say your name, once, clearly. You count. You think of the exact particular small things that are yours and that are grounded and that cannot be generalized. You hold the rope, and you come out. That is all. That is the whole of Cora Vess, and the whole of Widow's Cut, and the whole of what I have been able to find out about both. I hope it was worth the 3 hours. I believe it was worth the 3 hours, because I think the cases that stay with you, the ones that come back to you at 4 in the morning when you are lying still in the dark, are the ones where the lesson is not just about the case. They are the ones where the lesson is about you. Stay yourself. Count if you need to. Know the back of the hand. Say the name once and mean it. That is the whole of it. Good night. Say your own name out loud before you sleep tonight. Just the once. Clearly. In your own voice. In a room you know. It is the surest rope there is. Good night.